Hello there, thank you for being here, and for choosing to spend these quiet final moments of your day with me. Before we begin, please set your volume to a comfortable level, lie down, let your body settle, and if you're ready, gently close your eyes. There's nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to do. Just listen, and let the words carry you slowly towards sleep. This is the very first story in our new series, Boring History for Sleep, where everything is calm, quiet, and just a little bit uneventful. If this brings you a sense of peace, feel free to leave a like and subscribe, so you'll never miss another sleepy journey. Now, let's begin with tonight's story. What the Hittites left behind. Long before the clamor of modern empires, long before the names you've come to memorize in history class, there was a people who carved out a quiet legacy, buried beneath layers of earth and time, the Hittites. Their name does not echo loudly in today's world, but what they left behind tells a different story. Tonight, as you lie still and let the weight of the day fall away, we begin in the soft shadows of Anatolia, where cool winds once passed over stone citadels and distant drums echoed through pine-covered hills. The Hittites were not loud conquerors. They were not poets of their own glory. They simply were. And in being so, they etched their presence into clay tablets, stone walls, and memory, waiting quietly for someone to notice. The world they lived in was a tapestry of gods, treaties, harvests, and wars, but also of silences. Long silences between words carved into stone, between seasonal feasts and the slow rise of the sun over hilltop cities. We begin with the city of Hattusa. Its stones still lie where they fell, crumbled under centuries of rain and wind. But in their time, they were grand. Massive walls wrapped around the city like arms holding secrets. Each gate bore a name: the Lion Gate, the King's Gate, the Sphinx Gate, and each one whispered a piece of the Hittite story. No one rushed through these gates. Merchants moved at a patient pace. Soldiers in bronze helms guarded with calm eyes. Scribes recorded taxes, births, and dreams, with styluses pressed gently into clay. In Hattusa, life moved slowly, steadily, like a stream under winter frost. And that's where we begin, among quiet ruins that once stood proud under Anatolian skies. The Hittites were builders, but not just of stone. They built systems, laws, agreements. They were among the first to draft peace treaties, real ones, between kings, not just declarations of surrender. The most famous of these, between the Hittites and the Egyptians after the Battle of Kadesh, remains etched on the walls of Egyptian temples, but also in the memory of what diplomacy once meant. That treaty, it wasn't about who won or lost. It was about staying alive, about choosing quiet stability over endless noise. The Hittites understood something that many after them would forget. Sometimes the strongest empires are those that know when to stop fighting. Their laws were strangely modern: fines instead of lashes, trials instead of revenge. A goat stolen, pay 2 back. A field burned, make it right. These weren't the laws of tyrants. They were the quiet codes of a people who preferred balance. Of course, there were kings, some ambitious, some wise, some only names on a list. But power in Hittite lands often shared its weight, with councils, with priests, with the rhythms of the harvest. Their gods were many: storm gods, sun gods, grain gods. Every force of nature had a face, a name, a temple, and every temple had its caretakers. Rituals were steady and soft, like morning prayers in an empty field, grain scattered, water poured. Words spoken slowly, so the gods wouldn't miss a syllable. Even war, when it came, was not chaos. It was planned, announced, recorded. A campaign might be written on a clay tablet in tidy rows, like a recipe or an inventory. No flourish, no shouting, just a slow recounting of where they marched, who they met, and what they left behind. And always what they left behind. Because the Hittites knew that even victories vanish. But clay endures, stone survives, and silence speaks if you listen long enough. Tonight, as your breath slows and your body softens into stillness, imagine Hattusa beneath a pale moon. A soldier leans against the gate, eyes half closed. A scribe in a quiet chamber lights a lamp to finish one more line. Somewhere, a farmer dreams of rain, and somewhere else, deep in the future, someone like you is just beginning to remember them. Not through battles, not through noise, but through what they left behind. As the stars turned slowly above ancient Anatolia, we continue drifting through the quiet remnants of the Hittite world. If you listen carefully, not with your ears, but with something deeper, you may begin to hear the rhythm of their lives, steady and deliberate, like the careful strike of a hammer shaping bronze, or the rustle of grain gathered under a midday sun. The Hittites understood the importance of structure, not just in buildings, but in time, in behavior, in how people should live together without falling into chaos. At the center of their society stood not only kings and warriors, but scribes, guardians of language, preservers of memory. Thousands of clay tablets have been unearthed from their archives, each pressed with cuneiform, each a snapshot of something long gone. Some recorded simple inventories, barley, goats, oil. Others captured legal rulings, prayers, letters between distant officials. And some were myths, stories of gods and monsters, of kings who spoke with deities and dreams that carried warnings. One such myth, the tale of the lost god Telepinu, speaks of a world plunged into drought and despair when the god of agriculture disappeared. The solution wasn't a grand battle or a divine punishment. It was a gentle search. A goddess sent a bee to find him, not a warrior, not a storm, but a bee. And the bee, small and steady, stung the sleeping god awake. Crops returned, rain fell again, and life went on. This was the Hittite way, resolving imbalance not with thunder, but with persistence. Even in their language, there was care. The Hittite tongue, now long extinct, was the oldest known Indo-European language recorded in writing. It moved like soft footsteps over stone, delicate in tone, but firm in purpose. Their scribes sometimes translated Babylonian or Sumerian texts into Hittite, preserving what they admired, adapting what they needed. This openness to others, this quiet fusion of cultures, helped them thrive not through domination, but through understanding. In their homes, people lived simply, wooden beams, packed earth, modest courtyards, not palaces for the common folk, but spaces of warmth and repetition. Meals were humble, bread, lentils, a bit of goat cheese, honey when lucky. No feasts for show, just nourishment passed hand to hand. Children grew up learning not only farming or herding, but rituals, respect, the stories that shaped their world. They were not told to rush, they were told to remember. The land itself held its breath beneath their feet. Volcanic hills, dense forests, rivers that gleamed like silver threads under the sun. Seasons moved predictably. Winters were harsh, but never forever. And when spring returned, so did the ceremonies. Fields blessed, seeds scattered, words offered to the gods in exchange for the promise of green. The Hittites never tried to erase the world around them. They worked with it. Even their enemies, when captured, were often not destroyed but absorbed. Cultures blended, borders softened. The empire, at its peak, stretched from the Aegean Sea to the edge of Mesopotamia, but it didn't scream its power. It held it quietly. The power of patience, the strength of stillness. Their capital, Hattusa, was not chosen for glamour. It sat in a rugged area, surrounded by cliffs and hills, not easy to reach, but it was defensible, predictable, solid. From there, they sent letters, messengers, carts filled with grain or gifts to other lands. And they received horses, spices, metals, songs. The world spoke many tongues, but in Hattusa, they listened. Even today, the remains of their archives tell stories not only of kings and treaties, but of weather reports, omens read from bird flights, and dreams described in detail. A king might ask his priest to interpret a bad night's sleep. A farmer might request a ritual to bless his oxen. No detail was too small. Because the Hittites knew, empires do not fall only from invasions. They fall from forgetting the little things. And so they remembered, tablet by tablet, day by day. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the warmth of a sunlit archive room. Shelves lined with clay, the air thick with silence. A young scribe leans forward, stylus in hand, copying a list of items from a village 2 valleys away. He yawns but doesn't stop. The inkless script flows on. Outside, a breeze carries dust across the courtyard. A dog sleeps beneath the shade. And in the sky above, nothing urgent moves, only clouds, only time. This is what the Hittites left behind. Not glory or gold, not towering myths or endless wars, but something softer, systems, memories, a way of being. a quiet thread through the noisy fabric of history, and tonight that thread is yours to follow, wherever it leads. Let us now turn gently toward the people themselves, the ones who lived behind the stone gates, who walked those winding paths and filled the courtyards with quiet footsteps. The Hittite Empire, though large and powerful for its time, was never held together by fear alone. It was held by routine, by trust, by roles understood and repeated through the rhythm of daily life. A woman might rise before dawn to knead dough while the stars still shimmered. Her hands moved without rush. She had done this before. Her mother had too. The scent of baking bread slowly filled her modest home, seeping through wooden beams and warming the cool air of morning. A child stirred in sleep, comforted by its familiarity. Meanwhile, a man might lead his oxen into the field, not with whips, but with calm commands passed down over generations. He would glance at the sky, noting the clouds, the wind, the mood of the day. Nothing was random, nothing was rushed. Even animals seemed to understand the slow, deliberate pace of the Hittite day. In towns and villages, elders sat beneath shaded porches, recounting stories of gods and old kings, not to boast, but to remind the young of where they came from. These stories were not dramatic or wild. They were gentle, often ending not with triumph, but with balance. A god grows angry, but is soothed. A mistake is made, and slowly repaired. Even their myths encouraged steadiness. In temples, rituals were carried out not with dazzling displays, but with repetition. Water poured slowly, grains offered in measured handfuls. Priests chanted softly, voices rising and falling like waves in a quiet bay. There were no loud conversions, no forced beliefs. The gods did not demand fear, they asked only to be remembered. And so the Hittites remembered them with quiet devotion. Trade was another quiet strength. Caravans moved slowly across the dusty roads, their wheels creaking, their drivers wrapped in cloaks to shield from sun or wind. Goods passed from hand to hand: tin, wool, leather, honey, and sometimes stories. A traveler might bring word of a distant kingdom, of a flood, a wedding, a new breed of horse. Information moved as slowly as the carts, but it moved, and the Hittites listened. In return, they shared what they had: sturdy tools, calm diplomacy, and knowledge recorded in clay. Even their warriors, when needed, moved with structure. They did not rush into battle for glory's sake. They prepared, trained, studied the land. Their chariots, light, efficient, pulled by small but hardy horses, were built not for show, but for balance, to maneuver, to retreat, to protect. They were skilled, but they preferred peace when it could be kept. And when it couldn't, they recorded their battles with a strange calm. No boasting, no grand claims. Just the facts, the names, the losses, the outcomes. As if they knew someone, someday, might read it and sigh. The royal family lived with more than others, of course. Their palaces were larger, their meals richer, but even the kings were not untouchable. Their decisions could be questioned. Priests might interpret omens, councils might push back. Power was not absolute. It was shared, quietly, through layers of tradition and unseen threads of responsibility. And when a king died, he was mourned not with spectacle, but with structure. The rituals were long but not loud. His spirit would be guided carefully into the realm of the ancestors, step by step, word by word. Nothing skipped, nothing rushed. Because endings, like beginnings, mattered deeply to the Hittites. They believed that life, like a well-carved tablet, should be complete. As the night deepens around you, imagine a simple village near the edge of the empire. A dog barks in the distance, a door creaks open, a family sits on woven mats, sharing a bowl of stew. The fire crackles softly, outside the stars gather. Overhead, somewhere in the hills, the wind moves through the trees the same way it did thousands of years ago. And though their names may be forgotten, their ways remain. In quiet repetition, in kindness passed forward, in every moment that favors stillness over noise. This is the heart of the Hittite legacy, not a headline, not a monument, but a rhythm, one that hums softly under the louder pages of history, waiting for those willing to slow down and listen. Beyond their temples and homes, beyond the slow breath of the land they lived upon, the Hittites left something else behind, something quieter, more delicate, and perhaps more enduring than stone or clay. They left behind ways of thinking, invisible traces of how they saw the world, how they measured value not in noise, but in continuity. In their view, time was not a race. It was a cycle. The seasons turned, but they always returned. Crops grew, were harvested, then planted again. Families aged, children grew, and one day took the same paths their parents had walked. Nothing was final. Everything was part of a soft rotation, a rhythm that asked not for speed, but for care. Even their writing, pressed into clay with a stylus, reflected this. Each mark required patience. A hasty hand would break the tablet. A rushed scribe would lose meaning. And so, sentence by sentence, the Hittites preserved their world, not through speeches or monuments, but through measured words on small slabs of earth. It was their way of speaking to the future, of saying, "This mattered, please remember." And so we do. Their understanding of justice was rooted in restoration, not revenge. If a neighbor damaged a wall, he repaired it. If someone stole a sheep, they returned it with interest. The goal was not to punish, but to restore balance. It was a society not built on fear, but on mutual understanding, on the quiet belief that people, when given structure and guidance, could live peacefully together. This belief extended to their diplomacy. When the famous peace treaty with Egypt was signed, it wasn't merely a symbolic gesture, it was an act of wisdom. The Hittites had fought hard. They had lost soldiers, time, and resources. So had the Egyptians. But instead of continuing the cycle, they ended it. They shared terms, they exchanged daughters in marriage, they pledged to support each other against mutual threats, and they recorded it in both languages. 2 versions, 2 truths, 1 agreement. Even today, you can see the copy that the Egyptians carved in stone on a temple wall. It is large, formal, and proud. The Hittite version, by contrast, was found on a clay tablet, small, portable, practical, not lesser, just different, reflective of who they were, practical, humble, steady. And when you consider the flow of history, when you think about how rare peace was in a world often driven by ambition and conquest, the quiet wisdom of that treaty becomes louder than any battle. In their art, the Hittites favored symbols over spectacle. Reliefs carved into stone depicted gods standing side by side, kings holding hands with divine figures, animals in motion, not exaggerated, not grandiose, just balanced. Often their gods were shown as equals, not towering over humans, but walking among them. This suggests something profound. The Hittites did not see themselves as beneath the divine, nor above the earth. They were part of something shared, a middle layer in a larger harmony. Their sacred spaces reflected this balance. Temples were not meant to intimidate. They were designed to fit within the landscape, not dominate it. Built of stone and timber, surrounded by courtyards and gardens, they were places where the natural and spiritual gently met. And inside, rituals took place with quiet focus. Offerings of grain, oil, and wool, incense burning slowly, prayers whispered more often than sung. There was no rush to be heard. The gods, they believed, listened patiently. All of this reveals a culture that valued steadiness, not drama, resolution, not dominance. In their burial practices, too, we find the same calm acceptance. The dead were honored, but not feared. Tombs were simple. The body was laid to rest with a few personal items, tools, vessels, amulets, sometimes a small tablet with a name or a prayer. Nothing extravagant, because in Hittite belief, death was not a grand finale. It was a return, a rejoining of the cycle. The soul, like the sun, would rise again in another form, or rest among the ancestors. The focus was not on what came next, but on leaving this life in balance. And so the rituals were exact, not because they feared punishment, but because they respected the moment. As you lie here now, breathing softly, know that somewhere under layers of earth and time, those resting places remain, silent, undisturbed, sheltering the memory of people who lived not for glory, but for balance. And in that balance, they found a kind of quiet power, not the kind that conquers, but the kind that endures. And tonight, in the space between your breaths, that power lingers still. As we continue wandering through the quiet corridors of time, let us step into the part of Hittite life that was often the most overlooked by the outside world. It's silence, not absence, but presence. A silence filled with the sound of sandals over stone paths, the creak of wooden doors, the faint calls of herders on distant hills. A silence not meant to be broken, but observed. In that silence, their cities functioned. Their marketplaces were not the roaring centers of chaos that you might expect. Instead, they were places of rhythm. Buyers and sellers moved in quiet negotiation. Hands gestured. Prices were shared with few words. Trust was more valuable than coin. A potter set out his clay bowls, their surfaces smooth and undecorated, practical in purpose, meant for holding water or food, not art for art's sake, but beauty through function. A woman unrolled a length of woven cloth, running her fingers over its texture, not to impress, but to remember the hands that had made it. Trade was more than commerce, it was connection, and in the Hittite world, connection was sacred. Roads led outward from Hattusa, like veins from a heart, winding through mountains and valleys, reaching small villages where time moved even slower. Along these roads walked messengers, priests, farmers, and travelers, some carrying goods, others carrying stories. They were met not with suspicion, but with quiet hospitality. A drink, a place to rest, news shared at twilight beside low fires. Even strangers were part of the rhythm. In the countryside, life followed the breath of the earth. A field was plowed not for profit, but for survival. A shepherd sang to himself, not to pass time, but because the land listened. There were no crowds to applaud, only the steady presence of sky and soil. Children learned not through instruction, but imitation, watching, repeating, absorbing. A girl sat beside her mother, learning to spin wool, not told what to do, simply shown. A boy walked beside his father, carrying a basket of olives, mimicking his quiet steps. Education was not an institution, it was inheritance, passed on gently, one moment at a time. And if you imagine the evening in a Hittite home, you wouldn't hear lectures or commands. You'd hear the crackle of fire, the soft sound of chewing, perhaps a simple song sung from memory. These were people who knew that words had weight, so they didn't throw them carelessly. They spoke when needed, and when they didn't, they simply shared space. The same principle echoed in their laws. A man accused of wrongdoing wasn't thrown into darkness. He was questioned, heard, judged by peers who knew the cost of false judgment. Punishments were rarely cruel. Instead, they corrected, restore what was lost, apologize not with words, but with action, make the other whole again. Justice wasn't about vengeance, it was about mending, like fixing a broken door, not replacing it, but aligning it so it swings smooth once more. This mindset spilled into how they saw the cosmos. The stars weren't things to fear, they were guides. The moon's phases told time. Eclipses were warnings, but not curses. Priests observed the sky not to command it, but to read it like a slow book. Signs were interpreted patiently, nothing was done in haste. And so their calendars were shaped by what could be trusted: seasons, solstices, harvest cycles. No calendar was perfect. But for the Hittites, perfection was not the goal. Harmony was. You may find it strange, in today's world of noise and urgency, to imagine a people so deeply embedded in patience. But that's why they matter. Because they remind us that life doesn't need to be fast to be full. That what endures is not always what shouts, but often what whispers. Tonight, as you lie in stillness, know that the Hittite world moved to a different tempo, one that you too can feel if you slow down. Imagine the soft orange glow of oil lamps lighting narrow streets, the quiet steps of a priest carrying a bowl of water, the rustle of wind through cedar trees beyond the city walls, the hush of a mother pulling a blanket over her sleeping child. These were the real notes of their music, not performed, not written down, just lived. And in the space between each note, there was meaning. They didn't try to fill the silence. They honored it. And that too is something they left behind. For you, for me, for anyone willing to listen closely enough to hear it. As the night deepens and your body settles further into stillness, we continue our gentle journey through the forgotten calm of the Hittite world. So much of their legacy was never meant to dazzle. It was meant to last. Not to astonish the future, but to quietly exist within it. In their architecture, we see the same principle of enduring function. Walls of massive stone blocks, carefully placed without mortar, still stand after thousands of years. They weren't carved with intricate decoration or built to impress outsiders. They were designed to protect, to withstand seasons, to hold against time. Inside these spaces, warmth gathered. Families lived in quiet simplicity. Fires were tended in stone hearths. Wool was spun by hand. Meals were shared from common pots. It was not a grand life, but it was full of pattern, of repetition, of meaning, and the buildings reflected that. Thick walls, low ceilings, cool in the summer and insulated in winter. Roofs layered with timber and clay tiles. Courtyards at the center, open to the sky, where plants could grow and children could play under watchful eyes. It wasn't wealth that made a Hittite home secure. It was rhythm, predictability, knowing that each corner had a purpose, and each purpose served life as it really was. This practical sensibility extended to their cities as well. Hattusa, their capital, was no accident of geography. Built on a high ridge, surrounded by hills and valleys, it offered visibility and defense, but also peace. From its gates, one could see far in every direction, valleys spread like soft cloth, ridgelines rising gently in the distance. You could breathe in that view. You could pause. And for the Hittites, that mattered. Even their storage rooms were carefully organized. Barley, wheat, beans, oils, all preserved for winter or drought. Not stockpiled in fear, but saved with foresight. Each vessel was marked. Each measure counted. A surplus wasn't a symbol of pride. It was a promise to the future, to their children, to the land itself. And in times of hardship, these stores sustained more than just the body. They sustained trust. Communities gathered when harvests were lean. Food was shared. Hands worked together. Not under force, but under a common understanding that the survival of one was tied to the well-being of all. Their water systems, cisterns, channels, catchment basins, were built not with extravagance, but with care. They respected water not only as a resource, but as a blessing. Rain was captured, not wasted. Rivers were watched closely. Springs were guarded and often blessed by priests, who offered small rituals to thank the spirits of the land. Because even something as simple as water was seen not as a right, but a gift. And gifts were never taken for granted. In the rural parts of their world, these values held even more tightly. Far from the palaces and temples, villagers rose with the sun and slept with the stars. Fields were plowed by hand. Bread was baked in clay ovens. The days were long, but they were not filled with despair. They were filled with effort, and the quiet satisfaction of work done well. There was pride in the everyday, not the kind that seeks applause, but the kind that glows quietly inside a person who knows they've done what needed to be done. In the evening, after the animals were fed and the tools set down, families would gather near the fire, not always to speak, often just to be, to feel the warmth, to listen to the crackling wood, to watch shadows dance across walls of earth and straw. A father might hum a tune. A grandmother might tell a small story, something passed from her own mother and hers before that. No heroes, no monsters, just people, just moments. Real and small and precious. This too was how the Hittites shaped the world they left behind. Not through conquest or monument, but through these tiny, repeated acts of steadiness. They didn't try to change the land. They tried to live with it, to listen, to adapt, to give back more than they took. Tonight, as you drift further into rest, picture a hilltop at dusk. A shepherd wraps his cloak tighter against the breeze. A child chases a dog past a row of fig trees. Smoke curls upward from distant chimneys, and above it all, the sky begins to darken, soft and endless. The stars return one by one, just as they always have. And beneath them, a people once walked quietly, leaving no thunder in their wake, only the soft, steady footprints of those who chose to live in peace with their world. That, above all, is what the Hittites left behind. And it is still here if you are quiet enough to feel it. As your breath softens and your thoughts begin to drift farther from the weight of the waking world, we turn now to a quieter corner of Hittite life, one that unfolded not in palaces or temples, but within the invisible threads of belief that tied their days together. For the Hittites, faith was not loud. It was not something shouted from rooftops or enforced with fire and fear. It was steady, humble, integrated into the rhythm of daily life, like the rising of the sun or the turning of the seasons. Their gods were many, but not unreachable. There were storm gods and sun goddesses, grain deities and river spirits. But more than what they were called was how they were approached. The Hittites did not plead for miracles. They asked for balance, for continued rains, for peaceful borders, for health of herds and quiet in the home. And they gave thanks not with gold or grand processions, but with barley and wool, with oil poured into earth, with simple prayers spoken under breath. In temples, the sacred and the ordinary met. A priest would not stand above the people, but among them. Rituals were long but never hurried. Every movement was slow, deliberate. To honor the divine, the Hittites believed, one must move with care, speak with intention, offer without pride. In this way, every gesture became a form of reverence, lighting a lamp, baking a loaf, drawing water from a well. If done with mindfulness, each act could become a prayer. And this extended beyond the temple walls. The Hittites saw signs in the wind, in the direction of bird flight, in the health of livestock, and the shapes of clouds. They read the world like a book, one written not in letters, but in patterns. If the signs were unclear, they waited. They did not rush decisions. When omens were troubling, they performed cleansing rituals, not out of panic, but to restore balance. Their religion was less about control and more about listening, a relationship, not a demand. And when they recorded their myths, they didn't glorify battles or divine vengeance. Their stories were often about reconciliation. A god becomes angry, the world suffers. But through persistence, through bees, prayers, or quiet gestures, harmony is restored. Their mythology reflected their values. Problems were not meant to be crushed. They were meant to be understood and slowly, patiently resolved. This patient philosophy touched even the realm of dreams. The Hittites believed dreams were messages, not always clear, not always urgent, but always worth noticing. A bad dream might prompt a ritual, a good one might bring hope. But either way, they did not dismiss the world of sleep. It was seen as a place of contact, where gods and mortals could brush against one another in silence. In this way, dreaming itself became sacred. Perhaps that is why, even now, as you lie in stillness, the story of their people seems to fit so easily into the space just before sleep. Their world was one where quiet mattered, where sleep was not an escape, but a doorway, a place where questions might rise without answers, and that was perfectly fine. They understood that not everything needed to be solved. Some things just needed to be held. And perhaps this is what made the Hittite spirit so different. They did not shout to be remembered, they whispered. They folded their teachings into laws, their love into rituals, their questions into myth. And they trusted that one day someone might listen, not with urgency, but with the same patience they had shown the earth. Today their temples are mostly gone. Their gods' names lie broken in pieces of stone. But the way they lived, the way they listened to the land, to time, to one another, that still lingers. It's in the feeling of dusk when the sky turns from gold to gray. It's in the stillness of a room after the fire goes out. It's in the breath before a story begins. You don't have to speak their language to hear them. You only have to be quiet. So as your body becomes heavier and your thoughts begin to soften into dreams, imagine a temple courtyard at dawn. The sun is just rising. A breeze lifts a thread of incense into the air. A woman kneels beside a small altar, placing a handful of grain gently into a bowl. No one watches. No one speaks. But in that moment, everything holds still. And in that stillness, the divine arrives. Not with thunder, not with light, but with silence. The kind that doesn't demand. The kind that simply is as the stars continue their slow, steady arc across the sky, and your breath becomes a quiet rhythm beneath the weight of the blanket. We now return to the Hittite world, not as archaeologists or scholars, but simply as quiet observers, listening to the final echoes of a civilization that asked for no spotlight, only remembrance. While most empires shout their legacy through monuments and wars, the Hittites left something softer behind: relationships, agreements, and shared understanding that echoed far beyond their borders. One of their most overlooked gifts to the world was their diplomacy. In an age where power was often expressed through destruction, the Hittites dared to offer balance. They understood that alliances could last longer than victories, and that peace could be more durable than conquest. Their envoys traveled to Egypt, to Babylon, to the lands of the Mitanni and the Assyrians. They brought not threats, but tablets, clay messages pressed carefully with symbols of cooperation, promises of assistance, warnings of shared enemies. And on both ends of these messages, readers leaned in to interpret not only the words, but the tone, because tone mattered, just as it does now. A phrase written in haste could spark insult. A delay in response might signal disrespect. So the Hittites crafted their letters not just with precision, but with patience. Kings addressed one another as brothers, not because they were equal in power, but because to build trust, one must begin with dignity. These diplomatic records still survive, tucked into museum drawers and buried in archaeological journals. On the surface, they may seem dry. A list of shipments, a request for a princess's hand in marriage, a concern over stolen horses. But beneath the surface, they reveal something profound. A world where humans across vast distances still manage to connect, to compromise, to extend a hand instead of a sword. In one letter, a Hittite king gently scolds his Egyptian counterpart for sending fewer gifts than promised. Not in anger, but in jest, with a tone that implies, "I expected more from my brother." In another, two kings discuss the health of their daughters, both of whom had married into foreign courts. The concern was genuine. The tone, paternal. These weren't just rulers, they were fathers, trying to build families across borders. In a way, their treaties were not only political tools, but emotional ones. They reminded the world that beyond thrones and titles, people still worried, hoped, and looked for ways to preserve what mattered. The scribes who recorded these letters were trusted not just for their literacy, but for their discretion. They were the unseen weavers of peace, shaping words that would travel for weeks across mountain passes and river valleys. And when those letters arrived, they were not read aloud with flair. They were read slowly, carefully, each word considered, each pause meaningful. This attention to nuance, to tone, to emotional intelligence, that was part of the Hittite legacy. And perhaps it is something worth reclaiming. In our own world, where messages fly faster than thought and voices rise to be heard above the crowd, maybe there is still value in slowing down, in choosing our words as if they will last for centuries, in writing as if the person who reads it will do so in silence, trying to understand not only what we meant, but how we meant it. The Hittites lived in a time when misunderstandings could cost lives, so they made listening an art. Their diplomacy was not perfect. There were betrayals, there were broken agreements, but even in those failures, there was always a return to the idea that talking, truly talking, could mend what was broken. Tonight, as your mind floats gently between thoughts and dreams, imagine a scribe in Hattusa, seated at a low wooden table, a soft oil lamp flickering beside him. He dips his stylus into clay and begins to write, not for glory, not for his own fame, but for peace. His lines are slow, steady. He pauses often, choosing not the strongest word, but the kindest, the most enduring. Outside, a light wind brushes through the trees. A torch flickers by the city wall. And somewhere far away, another scribe prepares to read what has been sent. In this invisible line stretched between two hands, peace exists, not as a final destination, but as a choice, a thread, a tone, a whisper. And this, too, is what the Hittites left behind. As we near the quiet edges of this ancient story, the Hittites remind us not of what rises loudly, but of what remains quietly. Their legacy, scattered in shards of pottery, faded inscriptions, and long-forgotten customs, continues to whisper beneath the surface of history. It's not in the headlines of textbooks or the grand halls of museums that you truly meet them. It's in the subtle ways they chose to live, and more importantly, to let others live. One of the most telling reflections of their worldview was how they approached foreign religions, foreign ideas, and foreign people. Unlike many empires that sought to erase or convert, the Hittites absorbed. They welcomed difference, not as a threat, but as a source of wisdom. Within their archives, you find prayers written not only to their own gods, but to deities of neighboring lands. The storm god of Aleppo, the sun goddess of Arinna, the weather spirits of distant valleys. They had no need to claim superiority. Instead, they built bridges between beliefs. This inclusiveness wasn't weakness, it was resilience. By honoring other traditions, they added strength to their own. They created a spiritual mosaic, where no single voice drowned the others, but together they formed a harmony. This mindset extended to art, to language, to customs. In border towns, traders spoke multiple tongues. Marketplaces rang with dialects from across the ancient world. Craftsmen borrowed techniques from Syria, from Mesopotamia, even from the distant Aegean. The Hittite way was never about isolation. It was about learning, layering, listening. Their capital, Hattusa, became a crossroads, not just of goods, but of ideas. In one section of the city, a temple might be dedicated to a native god. In another, a foreign shrine was respectfully maintained. It didn't matter whose god it was, as long as it brought peace, protection, or healing. And in the daily lives of the people, this openness created something remarkable: stability. Where others saw difference as division, the Hittites saw connection. A Mitanni merchant and a Hittite farmer could both kneel before the same altar, offer the same grain, speak different words, but feel the same quiet hope rise in their chests. This acceptance extended even into law. Foreigners living in Hittite lands had rights, not always equal, but protected. They could own land. They could appeal to courts. They could marry, raise children, participate in rituals. In an age when many empires viewed outsiders as tools or threats, the Hittites saw neighbors. And neighbors, in their view, were not to be conquered. They were to be understood. This did not make the Hittites saints. They still fought wars, they still protected their borders, but their legacy lies in the fact that they left room. Room for others, room for difference, room for growth. Tonight, as your eyelids grow heavy and your body sinks deeper into stillness, picture a Hittite priest standing in a quiet courtyard. The sun is low, casting long shadows across the stone floor. In one hand, he holds a vessel of water. In the other, a scroll inscribed with prayers from another land. He speaks softly, not because he doubts, but because he trusts that the gods listen more closely to quiet voices. Behind him, a group of villagers wait their turn, each carrying small offerings: bread, herbs, coins. Some are Hittite, some are not. But in that moment, no one is asked where they came from, only what they carry in their hands, only what they hope for in their hearts. And in the hush that follows the final prayer, you understand what the Hittites knew so long ago, that to endure, a culture must be more than powerful. It must be generous. It must make space for others. It must welcome more than its own reflection. And so they did. In stone, in song, in silence. This too is what they left behind. Not monuments to themselves, but open doors. Doors that still stand if you are quiet enough to walk through them. And now, as we reach the final stretch of this quiet journey, the world of the Hittites begins to fade, not into darkness, but into the soft glow of memory. A civilization built not on spectacle, but on steadiness, not on domination, but on design. They have walked with us for a while now, through their cities, their fields, their temples, their thoughts. And it becomes clear that what they left behind was never meant to shout across the centuries. It was meant to last just long enough to be rediscovered, to whisper, to remind. As with all ancient peoples, the Hittite Empire did not last forever. Like the changing of seasons, their time came and passed. Their capital was eventually abandoned, their language forgotten. Their gods, once prayed to daily, fell silent, but decline did not erase what mattered. Even in their fall, they followed a rhythm, the rhythm of time, of nature, of things coming to rest. What caused their disappearance is still debated. Some point to invasions, others to internal collapse, drought, shifting trade. But perhaps in the end, it was simply the turn of the wheel. Empires rise, they steady, they fall. And what remains is never the noise, it's the foundation. In dusty archives and beneath hills of stone, their clay tablets lay buried for over 3,000 years. When they were uncovered, they told no tales of glory. They told of harvests, of treaties, of prayers, and somehow that felt more human than any legend. In their quiet fall, the Hittites showed that even an ending could be graceful. There was no final battle carved into history, no last desperate monument, just a fading out, a return to the soil from which they came. And yet here we are, centuries later, speaking their name once more, not because they demanded remembrance, but because they lived in a way worth remembering. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson. That influence is not always loud. That significance is not always measured by size, or by conquest, or by the noise one makes while living. Sometimes it's found in the way a people listened to the land, in how they treated strangers, in the care with which they recorded their words, in the way they taught their children to notice the turning of the seasons, in the softness of their prayers, in the balance of their laws, in the patience of their diplomacy, and in the humility of their stories. The Hittites were not perfect. No civilization is. But what they left behind, their patterns, their choices, their worldview, still hums quietly beneath the surface of modern life like a low note in a forgotten song. A note that, when heard again, stirs something gentle in the listener. Tonight, as your thoughts become lighter and your breath deepens, imagine standing at the edge of their old capital. The sun has just set. The sky is a wash of violet and silver. The walls are worn, but still standing, touched by wind, by moss, by time. You hear nothing but the distant rustling of trees and the slow crackle of a fire somewhere far away. There are no crowds, no music, no proclamations, just you and a world that once was. You reach down and press your fingers into the soil. It feels cool, familiar, and in that moment, you understand something the Hittites knew well. That greatness isn't always in what you build, but in how you live, how you leave behind a world a little more balanced than you found it. And as you rise, the stars begin to appear, one by one, like tiny reminders that even in silence, even in sleep, there is continuity. The Hittites are gone, but they are not lost, not as long as someone remembers, not as long as someone listens. And so, as you drift now toward rest, let that silence surround you. Let it comfort you. Let it carry you across the night. You are safe. You are still. And somewhere, buried deep in the earth, the story of the Hittites sleeps beside you, waiting, watching, whispering. What they left behind was not an empire. It was a way of being. And now, part of it lives in you. And just like that, our story has come to an end. The Hittites now rest once more, beneath layers of time and silence. Before we continue to the next quiet journey, if you're still here with me, I'd be truly grateful if you could leave a like and gently tap that subscribe button. It helps this peaceful corner of YouTube grow and reach others who may need rest, just like you. Now, let your body stay still, your breath stay soft, as we begin the next chapter in our Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we travel even further back in time, to a calm and ancient land. Welcome to the calm rise of the Sumerians. Before pyramids rose from the desert sands, before empires carved their names into marble or bronze, before kings claimed to rule by divine right, there was a quiet land where it all began. Not with fanfare, not with war, but with water, with soil, with time. Southern Mesopotamia, cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, saw the rise of a people whose story unfolded not in sudden conquest, but in slow, deliberate steps. The Sumerians. Their cities did not appear overnight. They emerged gently, like reeds growing beside the riverbank, shaped by floods, sun, and the soft persistence of hands that never stopped working. The land they inhabited was not forgiving. The summers were scorching, the winters dry, and the rivers, though generous, could turn violent without warning. Yet the Sumerians learned to listen, to observe the flow of water, the turning of the sky, the needs of the soil. And in that attentiveness, they built the foundations of what would later be called civilization. They dug canals with curved wooden tools, diverting river water into fields of barley and dates. They built levees not for pride, but to protect. Every step was measured, every decision tied to the rhythms of nature. They didn't seek to dominate the land, they partnered with it. Their cities, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, grew slowly from scattered huts to organized grids of clay brick homes and wide plazas. Streets curved around temples, not out of design, but necessity, shaped by the terrain and tradition. In the early hours, you might have heard the soft sweep of brooms against stone, or the gentle chatter of market stalls preparing for another day. Their homes were modest, mud brick walls coated in whitewash, interiors cool and shaded, courtyards filled with light and silence. Families prepared flatbreads, children fetched water, The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and sun-warmed reeds. No one rushed. The day unfolded with a kind of practiced slowness, as if time itself moved more gently here. In the center of each city stood the ziggurat, a step temple rising slowly toward the sky. Not sharp, not shining, but solid, a meeting point between earth and the divine. Priests climbed its levels to offer grain, wine, and incense, not because they feared their gods, but because they respected them. The gods were many, Anu, Enlil, Inanna, Utu, and each had their own domain, their own stories, their own moods. But the Sumerians didn't seek to conquer heaven. They sought to keep it in balance with the earth. Their myths told of creation not as a battle, but as an arrangement. Sky separated from earth, day from night, chaos into order. Their world, they believed, was not meant to be controlled, it was meant to be understood. And so they recorded it. On tablets of wet clay, pressed gently with reed styluses, line after line of symbols, cuneiform, emerged. At first, only numbers and goods, then names, then stories, contracts, laws, prayers. The birth of writing did not arrive with a trumpet. It arrived with a whisper, in the back room of a temple storehouse, where a scribe carefully noted the number of sheep delivered from a nearby field. And from there, it grew, not to impress but to remember, to keep, to pass on. In the still of a Sumerian night, you might imagine a scribe working by the light of an oil lamp. Outside, the city has gone quiet. The canal waters shimmer. The ziggurat casts its long shadow over rooftops. Inside the room, the only sound is the soft press of stylus to clay. Again and again, like the heartbeat of a civilization learning how to speak. This was the beginning, not of kings or empires, but of something quieter. Systems, symbols, seeds. They did not call it history, they simply called it life. And slowly, gently, life began to take shape, one line, one field, one sunrise at a time. As the early Sumerian cities settled into their quiet routines, something deeper began to unfold. Not just the laying of bricks or the digging of canals, but the gentle weaving of order into every corner of life. Where other cultures might have measured power in sword or conquest, the Sumerians measured it in structure, in predictability, in the ability to make sense of the world through patterns. At the heart of this silent transformation stood the temple, but it was more than a place of worship. It was the center of the city's rhythm. The temple was where food was stored, where workers were paid, where festivals were planned. Priests were not isolated mystics, but administrators, record keepers, guides. They helped organize harvests, manage resources, maintain justice. They were, in many ways, the architects of trust. Every season had its appointed rituals. Offerings to the gods were made not out of fear, but in the hope of keeping the balance intact. It wasn't about grand displays, it was about timing. On the day appointed for the spring planting festival, families gathered in the plazas. Children wore small garlands. Musicians played soft melodies on flutes and lyres. Grains were scattered on the soil. A prayer was whispered. Then, silence, waiting, watching the sky, hoping for rain. The gods of the Sumerians were not distant or vague. They were present in the wind, the rivers, the trembling earth. Each city had its patron deity. Inanna for Uruk, Enlil for Nippur, Enki for Eridu. These gods were not perfect. They were complex, emotional, often unpredictable, but they were not feared so much as respected. Their stories mirrored the rhythms of life itself: love, conflict, drought, renewal. And in those stories, people found themselves reflected. This quiet devotion extended into daily work. Bakers rose before dawn, preparing flat loaves for temple and table alike. Potters turned clay with steady hands. Fishermen cast nets not with ambition, but with patience. Each task had its season, each season its role. A missed day of irrigation could ruin a crop. A broken jar could mean a shortage of oil. So everyone watched closely. Everyone contributed. Even the scribes, cloistered behind temple walls, played their part. With stylus in hand, they recorded not only ledgers, but justice. Legal cases, arguments between neighbors, accusations of theft, marriage disputes, were written down with the same care as grain shipments. This marked the beginning of law not as decree from kings, but as a shared agreement between people. Hammurabi would come much later. But here, in these early cities, the idea had already taken root, that fairness was not a favor, but a foundation. Education, too, was gentle and steady. In small schools, young boys, mostly from elite families, learned to write by copying simple lists, tools, trees, types of bread. Then came phrases, names, dates, not for show but for memory. Each word pressed into clay was a link in a long chain stretching into the future. The students worked in silence, occasionally corrected by their teachers, occasionally daydreaming through the heat of the day. There were no bells, no uniforms, just clay, reed, and repetition. And in that repetition, knowledge began to echo. At home, life remained slow. Meals were shared on low mats. Stories were passed from mouth to ear. A mother taught her daughter to weave. A father showed his son how to trace the stars for the changing seasons. In the cool of the evening, families sat in courtyards as oil lamps flickered and the night breeze swept through the alleys. The city rested. The people breathed. The ziggurats stood silent, watching. And through all of it, life continued, not through invention or upheaval, but through trust in what had worked the day before. This was the rise of the Sumerians. Not sudden, not grand, but gradual, layer by layer, step by step. A civilization built on the gentle repetition of life itself. Tonight, as you rest, let their rhythm become yours. Let their patience remind you that great things do not always rise in thunder. Sometimes they rise in silence. And stay. In the steady heartbeat of the Sumerian world, time flowed like the rivers that nourished their cities, slow, vital, and always moving forward. But unlike rushing torrents of conquest or collapse, the rise of the Sumerians unfolded with the patience of people who knew the value of preparation. Their days were shaped not by ambition alone, but by attention. Attention to seasons, to details, to one another. This attention found its expression in one of their greatest contributions to human civilization, organization. While the term may sound dull in the grand scheme of history, for the Sumerians, it was the secret to surviving and thriving in an environment that gave much, but could also take everything away in a single flood or failed harvest. Organization began with the land. The Sumerians developed a deep respect for boundaries, not of war, but of irrigation. Fields were measured in long rectangles. Canals were mapped with care. Records were kept of each field's owner, the amount of barley sown, the water allotted. A missing record could mean confusion. A surplus without storage could mean loss. And so they learned to think ahead, not just for themselves, but for the community. The temple played a central role in this organization. It wasn't just a spiritual hub. It was a warehouse, a workplace, a granary, and sometimes even a school. Surplus grain was stored for hard times. Workers received rations from temple stores, measured portions of barley, fish, dates, oil. In return, they labored on canals, tended fields, crafted goods. This was not slavery, it was structure, a kind of early civil service where everyone had a part, and each part supported the whole. Even the king, though powerful, was not above the system. Known as the Lugal, the big man, his role was not simply to rule, but to maintain order, to serve the gods, to ensure justice. His authority came not from divine blood, but divine duty. When he failed in that duty, stories say the gods withdrew their favor, and without that favor, he could not lead. The Sumerians were not governed by ego, they were governed by balance. In their legal texts, we see glimpses of this early sense of fairness. If a builder constructed a house and it collapsed, injuring the owner, the builder could be held responsible. If a field was flooded due to a broken canal, the one who failed to maintain it could be fined. These were not simple laws of punishment. They were laws of responsibility. Not fear, but accountability. A system that understood that people were fallible, but that justice, if written clearly and followed consistently, could protect the community. Commerce followed the same principles. Traders didn't rely on verbal promises alone. They sealed their deals with contracts, on clay tablets, stamped with cylinder seals unique to each individual. These seals, often carved with tiny, intricate scenes, were rolled over wet clay like a signature. No two were alike. And when disputes arose, scribes referred back to these agreements, not to judge the soul, but to clarify the facts. The market itself was not loud or chaotic. It was measured. Sellers displayed goods, wool, fish, grain, beer brewed from barley. Buyers haggled with gestures more than words. Children lingered near stalls, watching the exchange of copper for bread, of silver rings for tools. And behind it all, scribes noted the flow of goods, watching, recording, preserving. This deep sense of order shaped their view of the cosmos. The stars above were not scattered points of mystery. They were part of the same pattern. Movements were tracked. Celestial events were observed and logged. The gods, they believed, used the sky as a form of writing. Eclipses, planetary alignments, phases of the moon, these were signs, not omens of doom, but reminders that the universe, too, followed a rhythm. That just as rivers flooded and receded, so too did fortune and hardship. And if one paid attention, one could move in harmony with the larger design. Tonight, as you lie in stillness, imagine walking the shaded paths of a Sumerian city. The mud brick walls rise gently around you. The canals glisten under the fading sun. A woman lifts a basket of dates onto her head. A young boy leads a donkey through a narrow alley. The distant ziggurat glows softly in the last light of day. No one rushes. No one shouts. Everything has its place, its rhythm, its reason. And you, too, belong within it. As night deepens across the sleeping plains of ancient Sumer, we step gently into the quieter corners of their world. Not the courts, not the temples, but the homes, the hearths, the unrecorded moments that held entire lives. In the history of empires, these are the parts often forgotten. But here, in this story, they matter just as much. The ordinary Sumerian family lived a life of quiet repetition. Their homes were made of sun-dried mud bricks, simple but sturdy, laid in rectangular forms with central courtyards that caught the light by day and cradled cool air by night. The walls were thick, insulating the family from the summer heat and the rare chill of winter. Flat roofs doubled as sleeping spaces when the nights grew too warm. The furniture was minimal, low benches, woven mats, clay jars for oil, grain, and beer. But within these modest walls unfolded the full rhythm of human life. Children played with clay toys, little carts, tiny animals, carved dolls. They learned by watching, by listening. A mother's voice guiding her daughter's hands through the motion of grinding grain on a stone slab. A father showing his son how to mend a net or tie a proper knot. There was no formal curriculum. Life itself was the lesson. Food preparation was slow and mindful. Barley was soaked, ground, baked. Fish was salted and dried. Dates were crushed into sweet paste. Cooking fires crackled softly through the afternoon, sending up light smoke that drifted across rooftops like the scent of memory. Meals were taken together, not as feasts, but as constants, quiet pauses between work and sleep. A bowl of porridge, a slice of flatbread, a pot of beer diluted with water. Conversations were unhurried. Sometimes there was laughter, sometimes only silence. The days began early. The sun, rising over the flat horizon, bathed everything in soft gold. Roosters called, tools clinked. Water jugs were lifted onto shoulders. Those who worked the fields moved out with the light, walking narrow paths along canal banks, their reflections flickering in the water. In the fields, labor was shared. Men and women together planting, weeding, harvesting. Their hands were calloused, their bodies strong, but their movements were not rushed. Every gesture had been learned over generations, each seed placed with care. The land did not respond to haste. It asked for rhythm, for patience, for presence. And so they gave it. Evenings returned the family to one another. Lamps were lit using pressed sesame oil. Shadows danced on mud brick walls. Stories were told, not from books, but from memory. Legends of gods and animals. Fables with lessons buried like seeds. A jackal outsmarting a lion, a bird rescuing a farmer. These were not merely entertainments. They were instructions on kindness, on cleverness, on how to live in a world where floods could come without warning and peace could never be taken for granted. Among these quiet stories, you might hear the voice of an elder humming a tune, perhaps one they had sung as a child, or one that came from no memory at all. Just the rhythm of a life spent watching the stars turn, the canals rise, the bread rise in the oven. Music was part of life too, small lyres strung with gut, flutes carved from reeds, percussion made from clay jars or bare hands. There were no grand performances, just small songs that wove their way through moments like thread, sung while working, hummed while rocking a child, whispered into the quiet to remind themselves they were still here, still living, still part of something old and slow and strong. Even in the rituals of rest, there was intention. Beds were little more than mats. Blankets were woven from wool or flax. A child might curl up against their mother. A father might sit at the doorway for a moment longer, watching the last glow of the ziggurat fade behind the city walls. The silence of Sumerian nights was not empty. It was full of crickets, of wind, of unseen hands tending unseen fires. And in that stillness, sleep came not as an escape, but as a continuation. Another part of the rhythm, another turn in the cycle. Tonight, as your breath slows and your thoughts begin to drift, imagine yourself in that world. A clay lamp flickering softly beside you, the scent of baked bread still lingering in the air. Somewhere nearby, a lullaby hums through the darkness, not loud, not urgent, just present, like the Sumerians, like the earth, like the slow, enduring rise of something sacred. As the soft hum of Sumerian life carried on through the centuries, another quiet revolution was taking place. Not one of armies or kings, but of symbols, of marks pressed into clay, of ideas frozen in time. The birth of writing, which had begun as humble accounting, tallies of grain, lists of livestock, was slowly becoming something more, something deeper. The Sumerians did not invent writing all at once. It emerged gradually through repetition and refinement. First, pictographs, simple shapes to represent things, a fish, a jar, a tree. Then combinations of symbols to express actions, names, even emotions. Cuneiform, meaning wedge-shaped, was named for the stylus pressed into soft clay, forming delicate, angular impressions. What began as practical record-keeping quietly transformed into the written word, a new way of remembering, of sharing, of holding on to the fleeting. Scribes became essential to the world of Sumer. They trained for years, learning hundreds of signs, practicing long into the day. A single mistake could ruin a tablet. A smeared mark could change the meaning, so they worked slowly, carefully. In small rooms, by lamplight, they sat cross-legged on woven mats, tablets on their knees, stylus in hand. Some copied inventories, others preserved stories, court decisions, poems, and prayers. The written word became a second kind of memory, one that did not depend on the aging mind or the fragile tongue. It could be carried, stored, buried, and rediscovered. From this silent transformation came some of the world's first literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though evolving over time, had its earliest roots in Sumerian tales. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were reflections, meditations on power, loss, love, and mortality. Gilgamesh, a king who sought immortality, failed in his quest, not because he was weak, but because he was human. The Sumerians seemed to understand this deeply, that the purpose of a life was not to outlast time, but to live wisely within it. Writing was also used to bridge gaps, between rulers and subjects, between cities and gods. Letters were composed, often with great formality. A king might write to a temple priest, a merchant to a relative abroad. And when they did, they followed patterns of greeting, concern, request, and closing. These weren't just messages. They were gestures of respect, proof that even in written form, tone mattered, intention mattered. And clarity mattered most of all. The Sumerians knew that memory could be fragile, words could be misunderstood, so they shaped their writing not only for precision, but for calm. No unnecessary flourishes, just the essentials, what needed to be remembered, what needed to be passed on. These tablets were baked in the sun or fired in kilns. Some were sealed in clay envelopes, stamped with the sender's seal, a kind of ancient signature. Even disputes were resolved with tablets. Contracts for marriage, for land, for the hiring of laborers, all recorded, witnessed, stored, waiting quietly in temple archives or buried beneath homes, forgotten by the world, until thousands of years later, when modern hands would lift them from the soil and find that the thoughts of a farmer, a baker, or a teacher from 2500 BCE could still be read, still be felt, still speak. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavier and your breath slows further, imagine the soft scratching of a stylus against clay. A scribe working in the late hours, candlelight flickering against the wall. Outside, the city is still. The canals glisten beneath the moon. Somewhere, a dog barks once and then quiets. And in the scribe's small room, another line is finished. Another word preserved. Another thought made permanent. There is no audience, no reward, just the gentle satisfaction of knowing that something real has been captured. Something true. This was the magic the Sumerians gave the world. Not the flash of invention, but the patience of refinement. Not loud genius, but quiet care. A belief that the smallest mark, made slowly and with intention, could last longer than stone, could outlive empires, could carry meaning into a future beyond imagining. And now, as you rest, that same thread continues. Because in listening to this, you too are remembering. You too are part of what was left behind. As we continue drifting gently through the quiet legacy of the Sumerians, our gaze turns now toward one of their most remarkable yet understated achievements: the calendar of life, the subtle science of timekeeping, and the quiet mastery of the natural world's rhythms. While the Sumerians did not invent time, they were among the first to study it with purpose. In a land where seasons shaped survival, where floods could bring life or destruction, understanding time was not a luxury, it was a necessity. But true to their nature, the Sumerians approached it not with fear, but with reverence. They observed the movement of the sun across the sky, the rising and setting of the moon, the regular pattern of the stars. They noticed how certain constellations reappeared with the changing winds, how shadows lengthened or shortened depending on the season. They counted days not by rushing them, but by watching them. And from that deep attention, they began to measure. They divided the year into two main seasons, the summer growing season and the winter fallow. Their calendar, based on lunar cycles, included 12 months, each beginning with the first sighting of the crescent moon. Priests and astronomers would climb temple towers or stand in courtyards just before dawn, peering eastward, waiting. When that thin silver arc emerged, barely visible against the blue glow of early morning, it marked the beginning of a new cycle, a new record, a new set of tasks. The months bore poetic names: month of the harvest, month of the barley cut, month of the brickmaking, each tied to what the land required, what the people expected, what the gods watched over. There was no strict separation between science and spirituality. For the Sumerians, understanding the stars was part of honoring the heavens. Each observation was a small prayer, each calculation an offering. Days were divided by the position of the sun. Shadows marked the passage of time across temple courtyards, and water clocks measured the hours during cloudy days or nighttime rituals. They even divided the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, choices that would echo silently across the millennia into the present day, into the watches on our wrists, the dials on our walls. Yet, despite all this structure, the Sumerians did not obsess over time. They did not rush it. They recorded it so they could respect it. Farmers knew when to sow and when to rest. Builders understood when the clay was ready to shape. Sailors trusted the wind because they knew the pattern of the river's breath. Time was not a deadline, it was a rhythm. And so they moved with it, slowly, in harmony. Even festivals followed the flow of time. Religious celebrations were timed to agricultural milestones, celestial events, or mythological anniversaries. In the month of the new year, Akitu, the people would gather at the temple, not to celebrate grand victories, but to renew the world's balance. Offerings were brought, hymns were sung, rituals repeated from generations past reminded them not of change, but of continuity. That life, like the stars, was a cycle, a path to be walked again and again. At night, children lay beside their parents on the rooftops, watching the sky. A father might point to the belt of Orion, to the bull of heaven. A mother might whisper the story of Inanna's descent into the underworld, a tale of death and return, of the seasons sleeping and waking. The sky was not only beautiful, it was useful, and more than that, it was comforting, predictable, patient. As you rest now, let that same calmness guide you. Imagine standing in a Sumerian courtyard. Under a pale moon, the air is cool. A gentle breeze moves through the palms. Somewhere nearby, a priest records the phase of the moon on a clay tablet. A soft rustle of reeds sways near the canal. The temple stands silent, casting its long shadow across the sleeping city, and above, the stars wheel slowly on, unnoticed by most, but remembered by the few who chose to watch them closely. The Sumerians did not fear time. They befriended it, they honored it, and because of that, they found peace within it. Tonight, as you listen, that peace is yours too. As the quiet rhythm of Sumerian life carried on beneath the stars and across the slow, glimmering rivers, another gentle current moved through their world, one less visible but just as essential. It was the flow of trade, the careful exchange of goods, ideas, and stories between people, both near and far. And like everything in Sumer, it was not rushed. It unfolded with purpose, with patience, with trust. The Sumerians lived in a land rich in water and soil, but poor in other natural resources. There was no stone for building, no timber for large construction, and little metal beneath their feet. But instead of seeing lack, they saw possibility. They turned to trade, not as conquest, but as connection. From the Persian Gulf, they brought in seashells and fish. From the mountains to the north came timber, copper, and hard stones like diorite and lapis lazuli, deep blue, rare, and prized. From distant lands to the east came carnelian beads and precious oils. Each item arrived not as a trophy, but as a symbol of trust, of relationships built across rivers, deserts, and languages. Sumerian traders were not warriors. They were patient negotiators, travelers who understood that a single trip might take weeks, even months, through difficult terrain. They used donkeys to carry goods along dusty roads, followed by slow-moving carts and small boats guided down river channels by the pull of current and pole. The journey mattered as much as the destination. When they arrived, they did not demand, they bartered. Clay tablets show the careful record of exchanges: wool for copper, grain for bitumen, fish for incense. These were not casual dealings. They were agreements sealed with seals, with witnesses, with trust that extended beyond the spoken word. And so, slowly, the cities of Sumer became centers of exchange, not only for goods, but for ideas. In the markets of Ur or Lagash, one might hear multiple languages, see unfamiliar clothing, observe new tools or curious customs. And through this soft blending, Sumer grew not only in wealth, but in wisdom. Pottery styles shifted. New instruments appeared. The pantheon of gods expanded to include distant deities. And through it all, the Sumerians listened, adapted, and continued their rhythm. Trade also shaped how cities were built. Port districts emerged near canals. Storehouses expanded. Docks lined with reeds and mud brick steps welcomed boats as they arrived, their hulls heavy with goods and stories. Scribes waited to record each shipment. Workers unloaded in silence, guided by routine. Merchants greeted one another with nods, with shared meals, with agreements signed not on paper, but in clay. Even children learned the art of weighing, of measuring, of speaking with care. For to trade was to trust, and trust required practice. Beyond material wealth, trade brought stories. A traveler might describe the mountains of Elam, the temples of faraway cities, the customs of people who offered gifts before speaking or sang to their animals before sleep. These tales, passed from mouth to ear, slowly wove into the fabric of Sumerian life. Some were written down, others lived only in memory, but all of them reminded the people that the world was larger than their fields, their gods, their walls. And in that knowing, there was comfort, not fear, because the Sumerians did not seek to dominate the world. They sought to understand it, to meet it with open hands and open ears. And in doing so, they planted something that would outlast their cities, the idea that peace and prosperity could be built not by taking, but by sharing. Tonight, as your body softens and your mind drifts slowly towards stillness, imagine a boat arriving at the edge of a Sumerian dock. The water laps quietly against the hull. The sun is low. A merchant steps off, his robes dusty, his face weathered by long travel. He is greeted not with fanfare, but with a bowl of dates, a seat beneath a fig tree, and the warmth of recognition. A boy nearby watches as bundles are opened, textiles, stones, sweet-smelling oils, and listens to the low hum of voices in trade. No one rushes, no one shouts. The river continues its quiet flow, and in this simple moment, in this shared silence, something ancient and beautiful is exchanged. This, too, is what the Sumerians left behind. As the river carried traders across vast distances and scribes pressed quiet agreements into soft clay, the Sumerians continued shaping their world through something even more delicate and enduring than goods or laws. They built culture, not through spectacle, but through accumulation, layer upon layer of memory, tradition, and meaning. One of the softest, yet most lasting expressions of this was their art. Sumerian art was not made to impress, but to serve. It lived on walls, on seals, on pottery, on statues placed carefully within temples. It was humble in scale, but rich in symbolism. Each image, each figure, each line had a purpose. A man with hands clasped in prayer, a woman pouring a libation, a god seated on a throne of reeds, eyes wide, faces calm, always watching, always remembering. These were not portraits of individuals, but representations of roles, of devotion, of ritual, of the eternal relationship between humans and the divine. Even in their statues, the Sumerians valued function over flair. A votive figure placed in a temple stood in for the worshipper, silently praying in their absence. The wide, almond-shaped eyes were not for beauty, they were for presence, eternal attentiveness, a reminder that someone was always watching the gods. That reverence did not end when one stepped away from the altar. Cylinder seals were another quiet innovation. Carved in intricate reverse designs onto stone, these small objects were rolled across clay to leave impressions, tiny scenes of myth, labor, or ceremony. A seal might show a banquet, a sacrifice, a king in conversation with a god. These impressions served as signatures, but they were more than that. They were stories compressed into a few inches of space. Stories worn on belts, pressed onto jars, stamped into contracts. Personal, portable, permanent. Music, too, was part of their cultural breath. Lyres strung with gut, flutes carved from reeds, small hand drums tapped in rhythm with chants. Music accompanied temple rituals, harvest feasts, funerals. It wasn't performed for entertainment alone. It was part of the cosmic balance, a way to echo the harmony the gods had placed in the sky and the earth. Hymns to Inanna or Enlil were sung in slow, repeating phrases, each line a meditation. A lullaby might pass down not just melody, but memory, reminding a child not only who they were, but who had come before them. In literature, Sumerians left behind some of humanity's earliest reflections on hug, life, love, and the unknown. Beyond Gilgamesh were poems of longing, proverbs of wisdom, laments for lost cities. A scribe's hand might carve into clay a few simple lines. My lover is a sweet fig, ripe in the garden, or do not scorn the poor man's bread, his heart is rich with thanks. These fragments, thousands of years old, still feel familiar, still feel human. They show us that beneath the mud brick homes and formal rituals lived people who loved, who joked, who wondered, who grieved. Culture was not a separate thing. It was life itself, recorded softly, lived daily. Even fashion reflected this. Men wore long skirts made of sheep's wool, looped and tufted like rows of feathers. Women wrapped themselves in cloth draped over one shoulder, held in place with a simple knot or pin. Jewelry was common, earrings, necklaces, bracelets, all made from shell, stone, or metal. Not ostentatious, just enough to shine, just enough to carry meaning. Festivals brought this culture to life. In the plazas of Ur or Uruk, people gathered for days of music, food, and story. Processions carried statues of gods through the streets. Offerings were made not only in solemnity, but in joy. Children played, elders told stories, priests led chants that echoed off the walls and into the night sky. There was reverence, but there was also warmth. These moments did not belong to kings or temples alone. They belonged to everyone. A communal pause, a shared breath, a reminder that life was more than toil. That celebration, too, was sacred. And as the festival faded, as the statues returned to their shrines and the streets grew quiet once more, the people resumed their rhythm. Not with sadness, but with steadiness. Because in Sumer, nothing truly ended. Everything circled back. The river would rise again, the fields would bloom, the stars would return, and so would the songs. Tonight, as your own thoughts begin to circle, as your breath moves like a soft tide through your body, imagine a Sumerian artist sitting by lamplight, carving the final line into a seal. The room is quiet. The work is slow. Outside, the wind brushes gently against the clay walls. Somewhere nearby, a flute plays a few notes, and in this still moment, the world feels whole, balanced, remembered. And that is the essence of what the Sumerians gave us, not just a beginning, but a way to begin again, each time with grace. As we continue through the calm corridors of Sumer's long memory, our focus shifts once again, not to temples or trade, not to kings or scribes, but to something less visible, yet equally powerful, a force that shaped every decision, every ritual, every harvest and prayer. That force was belief. The Sumerians lived in a world that was not divided between the sacred and the everyday. For them, everything was touched by the divine. The wind was a whisper from the gods. The river's rise was not just nature, it was intention. Each shadow, each season, each silence carried meaning. Their gods were many, but not distant. They were not unreachable beings locked behind the sky. They were near, present, watching, often unpredictable. And the Sumerians responded not with fear, but with responsibility. They believed it was their duty to maintain balance between heaven and earth, to follow the rituals, offer the gifts, speak the prayers that kept the world in harmony. This was not a system of superstition. It was a framework of trust, of rhythm, of respect. At the heart of this spiritual system was the idea of me, divine decrees, cosmic principles, the invisible codes that governed everything from music to kingship, from weaving to justice. These me were held by the gods, gifted to humanity through myth, carried from the heavens in stories like Inanna's descent into the underworld. They were not commandments, they were truths, and the role of humanity was to align with them, to live in accordance with what had been placed into the world long before humans walked its fields. Every temple followed these truths. Every priest, every offering, every drop of oil and grain was measured to reflect the order of the universe. The gods had their domains. Enlil governed wind and authority, Enki ruled over water and wisdom, Utu brought light and justice, Ninhursag nurtured life and the land. Inanna, radiant and fierce, danced between love and war, between creation and descent. The stories told of these gods were not simple. They were layered, human in emotion but divine in reach. The myths were more than tales, they were lessons. When Inanna chose to descend into the underworld, stripping away her power at each gate, the people did not interpret it as fantasy. They saw it as metaphor, as truth embedded in symbol, a reflection of life's cycles, of death and renewal, of what it means to let go in order to return changed. Rituals were carefully timed. Offerings made according to the season, the stars, the needs of the land. A poorly timed sacrifice might not anger the gods, but it might upset the balance. And so the priests watched. They listened to omens, to bird flight, to dreams, not with panic but with discipline. They read the world like a living text. Every sign mattered. Nothing was rushed. In times of difficulty, flood, drought, sickness, the people turned to the gods not to beg but to ask, "Where have we fallen out of rhythm?" The solution was not punishment, but restoration, a special prayer, a fast, a cleansing of the temple, a renewal of the vow. Faith in Sumer was quiet maintenance, not show, not fear, but care. And even in death, the Sumerians carried this same belief. The underworld was not a place of punishment or reward. It was simply the next part of the journey, a land of dust and shadows, yes, but also continuity. The dead were buried with food, with tools, with small treasures, clay figurines, drinking cups, jewelry, because life, they believed, did not truly stop. It slowed, it shifted, but it continued. Tombs were simple, often beneath the floors of homes or near the city. Ancestors were remembered during festivals, their names spoken aloud. Their memory tended like a garden. There was no obsession with legacy, only the desire not to be forgotten. And even now, across millennia, we speak their names. Inanna, Enlil, Gilgamesh, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur. Names once whispered in prayers, now softly spoken in museums, in classrooms, in late-night reflections. Names that carry not only sound, but soul. Tonight, as your breath slows and your thoughts drift softly toward silence, imagine the courtyard of a Sumerian temple at dusk. The sky is pink and fading. A priest carries a vessel of oil, his footsteps gentle against the stone. Nearby, a woman places a handful of grain beside a statue, not to ask for riches, not to beg for mercy, but simply to give thanks. The gods do not appear, they do not speak, but the balance is felt, in the air, in the earth, in the heart of those who remember. This Nia, as the Sumerians knew it, soft, steady, sacred, and in its stillness it endures. And now, as we near the end of this quiet journey through the world of the Sumerians, it's time to look not at what they built, or wrote, or believed, but at what they became. The Sumerians, like all things shaped by time and earth, did not remain unchanged. They rose gently, over centuries, from villages by the river to cities that touched the stars with their temples. They built canals, carved stories, counted the days, listened to gods, and left behind not just objects, but a way of life, a rhythm, a way of being human. And then slowly their name faded, not because of war or collapse in a single day, but because of time's quiet movement. Other people came. Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, their languages blended, their cities changed, their gods were renamed, their myths rewritten, but the traces remained, not as ruins alone, but as echoes. The Sumerians were not lost, they were absorbed. Their legacy didn't vanish, it dissolved into everything that came after. The shape of their temples inspired ziggurats. Their system of writing continued for centuries. Their mathematics, their understanding of time, their laws, their myths, all passed down like a quiet river flowing beneath the surface. They had no monuments carved to proclaim eternal greatness, no boasting, no declarations of immortality, but their influence endured longer than most. Not because they demanded remembrance, but because what they left behind was useful, adaptable, rooted in care, in clarity, in truth. And so, the story of the Sumerians becomes not just a chapter in history, but a lesson. That greatness does not always shout. That civilization can rise without fanfare. That structure can be built from humility. And that the truest legacy is not in what we conquer, but in what we contribute, quietly, consistently, over time. Their world, of reed boats on still canals, of scribes shaping clay beneath flickering lamps, of mothers singing to children on rooftops under starlit skies, is gone. But it is not unreachable. It lives on in the ways we measure time, in the idea that laws can be written, in the thought that stories matter, in the belief that even the most ordinary day deserves to be remembered. And so tonight, as the story draws to a close, let us return once more to the calm of a Sumerian evening. The streets are dim now. The city breathes slowly. From a window, the faint glow of an oil lamp flickers. A family settles in for rest. Breadcrumbs brushed from a mat. A dog curls by the door. The stars, unchanged for thousands of years, begin to shine overhead. Somewhere, a child asks for a story, and someone begins, with a voice soft and low, to speak of kings and gods, of rivers and clay, of dreams written down to outlast the night. And maybe in that quiet moment, you too can feel it. That gentle pulse beneath the noise of history. The rhythm of those who came first, who built not for glory, but for balance. Who wrote not for power, but for memory. Who lived and listened and left behind everything. You carry part of them now, in your calendar, in your words, in your patience. You are not separate from them. You are the echo. And in this silence, as you prepare to drift into sleep, the oldest part of you remembers, not in names, not in monuments, but in feeling, in stillness, in the deep, slow breath of a world that once was and still is, if we close our eyes and listen. The Sumerians may have passed into the dust, but their story remains, soft, steady, waiting, like the earth, like time, like sleep. And that was the end of our story. The Sumerians now return to silence, their rhythm folded gently back into time. Before we continue to the next chapter, if you're still with me, a like and a quiet subscribe would mean the world. It helps this peaceful journey find others who may need rest, just like you. Now stay still, stay soft, as we continue with another slow walk through history in our series, Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we leave the rivers of Mesopotamia behind and drift across the sea to a quiet port city once known for its power, its trade, and its mystery. Welcome to A day in the life of a citizen in ancient Carthage. Long before the legends of Rome reached their height, and long before the great battles that would define empires, there stood a city by the sea, quiet in its morning light, steady in its rhythms, rich in its silence. That city was Carthage. And while history often remembers Carthage for its wars, its generals, its final destruction, there was so much more to it. Soft moments tucked between trade and tradition, between home and harbor, between the shadows of early morning and the heat of the afternoon sun. Our story begins not with Hannibal or war elephants, but with the rising sun over rooftops made of smooth sandstone and red tile, its golden light gently slipping through open windows. A citizen of Carthage, neither noble nor poor, wakes before the city truly stirs. His name is not important. It could be anyone's. A craftsman, a merchant, a man with calloused hands and a household to tend. The room is cool. The air smells faintly of salt and olive oil. Outside, the harbor is still quiet, but the gulls have begun their slow circling overhead. He dresses simply, a loose tunic of linen tied at the waist. He steps into his courtyard, where a small fountain murmurs softly into a stone basin. The walls around him are warm with fading shadows, and the potted fig tree in the corner rustles as a breeze moves through. His wife is already grinding grain with a small stone wheel. The children are still asleep, curled together on woven mats. There is no rush. The day will begin when it is ready. Breakfast is humble, flatbread baked the night before, dipped in oil, sprinkled with herbs. A few dates, a cup of watered wine. He eats in silence, seated on a low stool, listening to the city wake around him. From the street beyond the courtyard wall comes the gentle clatter of hooves, the wooden creak of a cart carrying amphorae of fish sauce toward the market. Carthage is a port city, and the sea is never far. The citizen's home is modest, but it is part of a larger whole, neatly aligned within a neighborhood of families, craftsmen, and traders. The roads are clean, the buildings orderly, the scent of the sea ever present. Carthage was a city of trade, and its people understood balance, order, exchange. He steps outside with a small satchel. Today he will visit the workshop, check on a shipment of dyes arriving from Tyre, and perhaps stop by the agora to hear the news. There is no shouting in the street, no urgency, just movement. The day stretches ahead like an open scroll. The air is warming now. Light reflects off the pale walls, and neighbors nod in passing, sharing no more than a word or two. This is not a city of grand display. Carthage thrived quietly, efficiently. Even its temples rose with elegance, not with boast. As the citizen walks, he passes the threshold of the Temple of Tanit, goddess of fertility and the city's patroness. He offers a quiet gesture, a hand over the heart. Not because he is told to, but because it is what is done. The gods here do not demand. They observe, they remember. Nearby, at a public fountain, a woman fills a clay jar while her daughter counts fish in a vendor's basket. In the background, the sounds of hammer against bronze echo from the smith's quarter, a gentle daily music of effort and trade. There are no monuments carved for these moments, but they matter. They are the rhythm of life. In the workshop, the citizen checks on his apprentices. A piece of dyed cloth is lifted to the light. Deep purple, rich, rare. It will be shipped across the sea, exchanged for silver, wine, perhaps a story. That is the Carthaginian way. Not to conquer, but to connect. Lunch is taken beneath an awning, cooled with damp cloths and the occasional breeze. Bread, olives, cheese, a simple stew, shared in silence, interrupted only by the soft thump of a fig falling from the tree overhead. The rest of the day unfolds slowly. A visit to the market, a word with the scribe, a short stop by the baths. The body, like the city, is kept in balance, clean, fed, respected. When the sun begins to fall, the citizen returns home. His children run to greet him. His wife hums as she stirs the evening meal. The courtyard fills with shadows. The city softens. From the harbor, the smell of salt and distant spices drifts inland. In the distance, temple bells chime softly, marking the day's end, not with command, but with calm. And as night falls over Carthage, as lamps are lit and doors are closed, the city returns to its breath, steady, soft, ancient, still. As the stars begin to settle into their places above the rooftops of Carthage, and the hush of evening winds through the narrow streets, the household, like many others, begins to fold gently into rest. But for the Carthaginian citizen, the day does not vanish all at once. There are rituals to close it, quiet habits passed down, not from law or decree, but from rhythm. The lamps in the courtyard are lit, small bowls of oil with wicks floating just above the surface, casting a soft amber light across the walls. The shadows grow longer, warmer, wrapping the home in a calm stillness. He sits again on the low stool near the fountain, hands resting in his lap, eyes drawn not to anything in particular, but to the sound of water trickling against stone. His children are near now, nibbling on cooled bread, a few dried apricots, voices hushed by the weight of the dark. There is no rush to send them to bed, no loud command, just the natural slowing of the world. The household is not large, but it is enough. It is secure. And the citizen feels this, not as pride, but as a quiet fulfillment. The meal was modest, the work was steady, the sky was clear. These things to him are blessings. In Carthage, the home is sacred, not extravagant, but central. The courtyard serves as its heart, open to the sky, edged with simple columns, vines growing in the corners, perhaps a bird resting along the stone ledge. At the base of the fountain, a small statue of Eshmun, god of healing, watches. A hand raised, a face serene, not demanding attention, simply there. As the city quiets further, the sounds grow fewer, a final creak of a cart, a murmur of voices behind a neighbor's wall, the sudden call of a night bird, and then stillness. In this stillness, the citizen begins his small offering, a shallow dish of barley, a few drops of oil, placed with both hands beside the doorway, not to beg, not to bargain, but to say thank you, to keep the balance between seen and unseen. These gestures are not dramatic. They are everyday, but in repetition, they become sacred. He whispers a few words, the same ones his father once whispered, and his father before that, words worn smooth with use. Words that do not seek to change the world, only to honor it. Elsewhere in the city, similar scenes unfold. In homes large and small, people pause before sleep, not in fear of what may come, but in gratitude for what has passed. The harbor glows faintly, lit by a few torches, the ships bobbing gently in their berths. Carthage sleeps lightly, always listening to the sea, and yet tonight all is calm, no war drums, no smoke, just the rhythm of a city built on trade, on patience, on understanding the tides. Inside, the children have fallen asleep, one with an arm draped over a blanket, another curled beside the family dog. The citizen watches for a moment longer, then rises. He walks slowly through the home, checking the latch on the gate, folding a cloth near the kitchen, placing a hand briefly on the wall. A wall built by hands he once knew, perhaps his uncle's, perhaps his own when younger. The past lives quietly here. It does not interrupt. It just remains. The sleeping room is simple. A woven mat, a folded woolen blanket, clay jars with water for the morning. As he lies down, he hears again the wind outside, gently brushing past the doorway, carrying with it the scent of salt and earth and fig leaves. His eyes close, but his thoughts drift, to the boats that arrived today, to the ledger he must check tomorrow, to the way the grapes are ripening in the neighbor's garden. These thoughts do not trouble him. They are familiar, safe. The body rests easier when it knows its place in the world. And he does, not as a hero, not as a ruler, but as part of the breath of this city, this Carthage, this place by the sea where morning returns slowly, and life, even in its simplicity, carries weight. And so the city sleeps, its stones cooling beneath the stars, its streets empty but never abandoned. And within one home, among many, a man drifts softly into dreams, his heart steady, his breath slow, his world intact. The sun returns softly to Carthage, brushing the sky with hues of pale gold and muted pink, rising slowly over the sea before reaching the whitewashed walls and clay rooftops of the city. Within the home of our citizen, the light creeps gently across the floor, through the open shutters, warming the edges of woven mats and the silent corners of the courtyard. A rooster calls in the distance, a wooden door creaks, and another day begins, not with fanfare, not with urgency, but with quiet rhythm. The man stirs from his mat, stretches slowly, and steps into the courtyard barefoot, the stones still cool beneath his feet. His wife has already risen. She moves with practiced ease, lighting a small cooking fire, placing water to boil. There is no need for words. These movements have been repeated for years, each one blending into the morning like part of a larger pattern. He rinses his hands at the fountain, splashes his face with water that smells faintly of earth and limestone. There is no mirror, just the feel of breath returning to the body, the gentle realignment between sleep and waking. He sits for a moment on the low bench near the fig tree, listens. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, a donkey brays, a child giggles, the distant sounds of the city beginning to stir. But here, inside these walls, all is still peaceful. Breakfast is light. A piece of barley bread dipped in oil, a few olives, a handful of pomegranate seeds, their sweetness sharp in the mouth. The family eats together in quiet. The youngest still drowsy, blinking slowly at the sunlight. The citizen rises again. Today he will go to the market not only to sell, but to observe, not to seek profit, but to learn. For Carthage is a city where the world arrives daily, where merchants speak a dozen languages and news travels farther than any ship. He leaves his home with a calm step, wrapped in a soft woolen cloak dyed the color of the sea at dusk. In one hand, he carries a small scroll of accounts, in the other, a token of thanks, an offering to leave at the shrine of Balhaman, protector of the city and its fortunes. The streets are warming now. Vendors are opening their stalls. Clay pots clink softly as they're arranged in tidy rows. Fish glisten on woven trays beneath palm fronds. Children sweep the stones with small brooms, their faces half hidden behind sleepy smiles. The market is not loud. It is alive, pulsing with quiet intention. The citizen passes familiar faces. A potter waves without speaking. A woman with silver in her hair nods as she lifts a basket of grain. These exchanges do not require sound. Carthage is a city that understands presence. At the temple steps, he pauses. The shrine is small but elegant, shaded by olive trees, its doorway framed by the red-painted columns. He kneels briefly, places the offering, a tiny pouch of salt, and bows his head, not in fear, but in respect. The gods of Carthage are not distant. They are woven into the routines, the breaths, the thoughts behind each action. From the shrine, he moves on to the dockside, where ships from distant lands have arrived during the night. Long vessels with high prows, their sails still wet with salt and dew. Crews unload amphorae, wine from Sicily, copper from Iberia, spices from the eastern deserts. A merchant from Gades speaks quickly with a local trader, gesturing to cloth dyed in brilliant shades of red and blue. The citizen watches quietly, noting the shift in goods, the tone of conversation. He speaks to a sailor he's known for years, asking about the weather on the open sea, about the mood in the ports farther west. Nothing urgent, just gathering knowledge one moment at a time. Back in the market square, he shares a midday meal with a friend, a lentil stew served in a shared bowl, with bread torn by hand and passed without ceremony. They speak of little things, of how the trees near the old well are bearing fruit earlier this year, of how the temple's newest priest has a voice like dry papyrus, of how the wind last night carried the scent of pine, and no one knows why. In Carthage, these details matter. They are the texture of life, the quiet signs of change. As the sun moves overhead and the shadows shift once more, the citizen prepares to return home. He purchases a small bundle of herbs and a length of dyed wool for his wife. He carries a jar of honey tucked carefully beneath his arm. The walk is slow. There is no need to hurry. The day is still unfolding, and Carthage, steady as always, continues to breathe with him. The walk home takes him along the eastern edge of the city, where the wind carries the scent of brine and sun-warmed earth, and where the sea glimmers softly beyond the rooftops and gardens. As the citizen makes his way through familiar paths, he passes quiet alcoves of worship, shaded by fig and olive trees, their small altars adorned with offerings from passers-by, a handful of grain, a few dried flowers, a smooth stone placed with care. He pauses by one, not because he must, but because he always has. It is these pauses that shape the rhythm of Carthaginian life, not grand gestures, but the small choices repeated each day, anchoring the self within the city's greater breath. Around him, the streets begin to warm with the hush of the afternoon. Traders call less frequently now. The marketplace has begun to fold into itself. Many stalls are covered, their goods packed away until tomorrow. Those who linger do so in shaded corners, drinking water from clay cups, their backs against sun-bleached walls. He continues, stepping past the bathhouse, where steam rises faintly from the rear vents. The baths are not luxurious, but clean, orderly, and reliable. He will visit them later, when the light softens and the crowds thin. For now, he carries his jar of honey, the length of wool, and the herbs his wife requested. The gate to his home is partly open. Inside, his youngest child plays quietly with a handful of stones, arranging them in small rows across the courtyard floor. The man smiles but says nothing. He places the bundle of wool near the loom, the herbs on the kitchen table, and the honey on a shelf carved into the wall. His wife nods in thanks. No words are needed. She examines the wool, running her fingers over it thoughtfully, already imagining the garment she will shape from it in the weeks to come. In the shade of the courtyard, he removes his sandals and sits on the bench beneath the fig tree, sighing not from weariness, but from the peace of being back within familiar walls. The sun has shifted. Its light slants through the wooden slats overhead, dancing in quiet patterns on the stone floor. The fountain trickles beside him, unchanged from the morning, and a small lizard darts across the wall, vanishing into a crack behind a jar of water. The house is quiet, but not empty. In one corner, his wife prepares food. In another, his daughter weaves small cords from leftover threads. These small, steady acts fill the home with presence, a presence that makes the walls feel warm, the air feel full, the silence feel earned. Soon he will rise and walk once more to the baths, where the water will wash away the dust of the day. The Carthaginian baths are not places of indulgence. They are places of balance. Warm pools, stone benches, pale light. People do not speak loudly there. They nod, sometimes murmur, but mostly they soak and sit and breathe. He steps into the bathhouse just as the light begins to soften into gold. A slave offers a towel. Another pours water gently over his shoulders. The basin is shallow, lined with smooth stones. The heat is not overwhelming. It seeps in slowly, loosening muscles that have carried weight, calming the breath that has counted many small decisions since morning. He closes his eyes, not to sleep, but to settle, to feel the water touch skin, the air change with each inhalation. It is, in its own way, a kind of prayer. When he returns home, dusk is settling across the city. Lamps begin to glow in the windows. The scent of warm bread and stewed lentils hangs in the air. In the courtyard, the table has been set with care, no extravagance, but an arrangement of simplicity. Clay bowls, a pitcher of water, a plate of dates, a dish of cheese wrapped in fig leaves. The family gathers slowly, each one arriving not at once, but as the day allows. They eat without hurry, each bite shared with murmurs of satisfaction, with the occasional story told softly between mouthfuls. The youngest laughs with a full face, crumbs on her chin. The oldest listens with eyes half closed, her hand resting on the table as if feeling the memory of her own childhood reflected in the words. And through it all, the house holds them, not as a shelter, but as a part of who they are, a place shaped by their routines, by the decisions of their ancestors, by the salt in the wind. And when the last plate is cleared, when the courtyard cools, and when the first star becomes visible above the garden wall, the citizen once more rises, steps toward the fountain, and dips his hands in water. Tomorrow will come, but for now, the city rests, and so does he. Morning once again finds its way across the rooftops of Carthage. The city, still wrapped in the soft breath of sleep, awakens not in noise but in warmth. The sea glows pale and wide beneath the first touches of sunlight, its surface broken only by the quiet ripple of fishermen setting out before dawn. And within one small household, behind sandstone walls and woven shutters, the citizen of Carthage begins his day as he always has, without alarm, without rush, without resistance. His eyes open to familiar patterns, the faded texture of the ceiling beams, the delicate shadow of the fig tree stretching across the courtyard tiles, the scent of clay pots and morning bread baking slowly near the fire. This familiarity is not dull, it is peace. He sits for a while before rising. The floor is cool, the walls are quiet. The world is still his. He moves carefully, respectfully, as if not to wake the house too fast. His wife is already tending to the morning meal, her steps as steady as his. A small pot simmers with grain. A jug of water rests on the low table, its surface dark with condensation. Outside the walls, the faint hum of the city begins again. Footsteps, wooden wheels, the occasional call of a seller preparing for the market. He washes his face at the fountain, splashes water over his neck and arms. The water is crisp and real and grounding. He pulls on his tunic, loops the belt, steps into his sandals. The tasks today are simple but important. He will accompany a friend to the grain exchange, check the storage bins near the warehouse, and stop by the home of a cousin whose child is nearing the age of apprenticeship. Such days are not written down in history books, but they are what made the city work. Carthage did not run on the shoulders of generals alone. It breathed through the hands and minds of people like him. People who walked the same streets each day, spoke the same greetings, made the same small but vital exchanges. The citizen leaves the house, walking with quiet awareness through the shaded alleyways of his neighborhood. Stone walls reflect the early light. Wooden doors creak open as others begin their day. A young girl carries a bucket of figs. A boy helps his father mend a fishing net. The world does not hurry here, it unfolds. At the exchange, men gather in circles, speaking in low tones, heads tilted toward ledgers and baskets. A few merchants from the east, wrapped in colorful shawls, speak in dialects not everyone understands. But the language of weight and measure, of salt and grain, needs no translation. He waits his turn, listens more than he speaks. Gives a nod where it's due. He does not bargain fiercely. He trusts the balance will hold. Afterward, he walks to the storage bins. Rows of stone-lined chambers holding wheat, barley, dried dates. He runs his hand along the edge of one, checks for cracks in the lining, for signs of pests or moisture. He speaks briefly with the keeper, an old man with a clear voice and a slow way of moving. They speak of quantities, of the smell of last year's grain, of how the southern fields are doing in this season's sun. Such conversations are not idle. They are part of the weave. Later, he visits his cousin's home, a modest place with a shaded porch and a line of herbs hanging to dry in the entry. The boy, barely 12, rises as the man enters, eyes wide with respect. They sit together, uncle, cousin, nephew, speaking of skills and futures. The boy is good with numbers, quick with his hands. He might be sent to the workshop near the docks, or to the tannery, or perhaps, if his father allows, to study under the city scribe. The choice will come soon, but not today. Today is for speaking, listening, remembering. The citizen gives a quiet blessing as he rises to leave. One hand on the boy's shoulder, one nod to the gods. It is almost midday now. The streets glow brighter, the air thicker. The smell of spice and salt drifts from the harbor. At a shaded stall, the man pauses for a drink. Cool water poured from a tall clay jar. He sits for a while, alone, beneath a cloth canopy, watching the slow movement of people, animals, and air. The day is not done, but it is full, and he knows, as he prepares to walk home again, that it is enough. Carthage moves on, quiet, unshaken, alive. The sun hangs high above Carthage now, its golden warmth falling across the stone streets, casting soft light through latticed windows, making the sea beyond the harbor shimmer like poured glass. In this hour, when even the busiest merchants have paused their work, when the market hums more gently and children have retreated into shaded rooms, the city takes its breath. It is not sleep. It is not idleness. It is something else, a slow, shared rhythm of rest and reflection. The citizen has returned to his home by now, the scent of olive oil and cumin rising from the kitchen, mingling with the sweet air of crushed mint. He removes his sandals just inside the doorway, sets his bag down, and pours himself a small cup of watered wine. In the corner of the courtyard, his wife is arranging folded linen, humming softly, not a song with words, but a melody passed down through memory. Their eldest daughter sits weaving, her fingers moving over the threads with care, not hurried, not distracted, each motion a silent testament to patience. He steps into the shade, sits on the bench beneath the fig tree once more. The day is warm, but the breeze from the sea keeps the courtyard bearable. The fountain beside him flows steadily, its water cool and constant, its sound blending into the silence rather than disturbing it. He leans back against the wall, his eyes half closed, and listens. not for anything in particular, but for everything at once. A neighbor's gate creaks gently, a dove coos somewhere above the roofline. A distant clang of metal reminds him that the smith's apprentices are still at work. Carthage is never truly quiet, but it is rarely loud. Even in its busiest hours, it carries itself with a kind of elegance, one that values continuity over chaos, harmony over haste. His thoughts drift, not with anxiety, but with ease. He considers the ledgers he will finish after rest, the grapes in the back garden that are nearly ripe, the passing comment made by the spice trader that perhaps this year the eastern winds will arrive early. None of these thoughts demand action. They are small stones in the stream of the day, noticed and then carried away. After a time, he rises again. There is work to be done, but it will be done slowly. In his study, a narrow room cooled by thick walls and a single high window, he unrolls the scrolls from the morning's meeting. His handwriting is clean, deliberate, the strokes of the stylus steady and unhurried. He marks the trades agreed upon, the names of clients, the promised dates. Every line has purpose. These are not records made for bureaucracy. They are made for memory. Carthaginians keep good records, not to control, but to preserve, to understand what came before, and to prepare for what will come again. When the scroll is set aside, he pours another cup of water and moves to the workshop, where two apprentices are smoothing the surface of wooden boxes meant for storing dried herbs. He watches them for a while, offers a small correction here, a word of encouragement there. He does not raise his voice. He teaches through presence, not pressure. One of the boys asks about a carving on an older box, an unfamiliar symbol etched in the wood. The citizen smiles. It is a family mark, he explains, his grandfather's. A small wave crossing beneath the crescent moon. He lifts the box, runs his hand over the carving, and for a moment, he is elsewhere, at the old home near the far gate, where he once sat as a child watching his grandfather do the same. Carthage is built not only from stone and trade, but from memory, from the silent passing of gesture and meaning from one generation to the next. As afternoon stretches on, he returns again to the courtyard. A late snack is shared. Some cheese, a small bowl of honeyed nuts, fresh slices of melon. The children gather, not summoned, but drawn by the rhythm of the household. They eat together, the table low and round, the bowls passed from hand to hand. Laughter comes, light and brief. One child tells a story overheard in the market. Another tries to mimic the accents of foreign traders. Even the dog, half asleep near the door, lifts his head for a crumb. This moment is not grand. It is not remarkable, but it is whole, complete. The kind of moment that Carthage gives freely to those who pay attention. As the shadows begin to lengthen and the sea breeze grows cooler, the citizen stands again, ready for whatever the evening may bring. He does not know the future, but he trusts the rhythm, the way the day unfolds, again and again, like waves upon the shore, quiet, persistent, eternal. Evening approaches gently in Carthage, like a soft fabric being laid over the day. The light turns golden first, then deepens into amber, touching every corner of the home with warmth before finally folding into shadow. The citizen stands in the doorway of his house, watching as the courtyard shifts from day to dusk. The vines along the walls sway faintly, their leaves turning silver in the low sun. The clay floor beneath his feet is still warm, but no longer hot. He breathes in slowly. It is the kind of air that reminds a man to be grateful, not for anything spectacular, but for the simple fact of being here, of stillness, of breath, of continuity. He will attend a small gathering at a friend's home, a quiet event, no formal invitation, just a few neighbors sharing conversation and figs, perhaps music if someone brings a flute. But for now there is time, and time in Carthage is not something to fill. It is something to honor. He takes a moment to wash his hands, slowly, at the courtyard fountain. The water is cool, and the stone basin smooth from years of use. He lingers there for a breath longer than usual, watching the water ripple, listening to its quiet rhythm. The fountain is not just decoration. It is memory. It has witnessed his children's first steps, his father's last words, countless meals, countless moments in between. Before he leaves, he steps into the storeroom to retrieve a small jar of dates and a folded cloth of dyed wool, gifts for the host. simple but thoughtful. In Carthaginian custom, hospitality is not only offered, it is mirrored. To be received with grace is to give with intention. As he walks through the neighborhood, the streets are filled with a hush. Not silence, but the soft blend of evening sounds, the call of a nightbird, the clink of pottery being cleaned, the quiet laughter of women braiding each other's hair on stone steps. Lamps begin to glow in narrow windows, casting golden squares onto the street below. The scent of roasted chickpeas and herbs lingers in the air. The city doesn't sleep yet, but it starts to exhale. At his friend's home, the entrance is open, welcoming. A servant nods quietly, gestures him through a shaded hallway. Inside, the gathering is already underway. Though no one is hurried, there are low cushions arranged in a semicircle around a table. A handful of guests sit talking softly, sipping from shallow cups. One man tells a story about a storm he once sailed through. Another woman speaks of a dream she had. Strange symbols, a lion near the harbor, a temple without a roof. No one laughs or dismisses her. They listen, because dreams are part of life here, not to be interpreted by books, but to be felt, shared, considered. The citizen offers his gifts with a nod. The host receives them gratefully, places the dates in a bowl, the cloth on a nearby shelf. The cloth, a deep indigo with a simple border, will likely be made into something practical. A head covering, a wrap, a satchel lining, nothing is wasted. Every thread becomes part of something. As the evening deepens, someone begins to hum, and another brings out a stringed instrument carved from olive wood. The notes drift upward like smoke, soft and winding. It is not a performance. No applause follows, just a shared moment, one that dissolves as gently as it began. The citizen sits quietly, saying little, but feeling much. These are the moments he cherishes. No declarations, no speeches, just presence, just the knowledge that here, in this city, among these people, he belongs. When the time feels right, he stands, offers a parting gesture, and steps out into the cooling night. The street is dim now, lit only by the stars and the occasional flickering torch. His sandals make soft sounds against the stone path. A dog barks once in the distance, then falls silent. Overhead, the moon has risen, pale and steady. At home, the courtyard is quiet. His family has gone to rest. He removes his sandals again, steps inside, careful not to wake the children. He pours one final cup of water, drinks it slowly, then sits at the edge of the fountain. The sound is the same as always, and that constancy brings peace. He looks around the loom, the herbs, the little pile of stones still left by his youngest child. Nothing dramatic, nothing new, but everything right. Before retiring, he walks to the garden wall and looks up. The stars above Carthage are old, older than the city, older than memory, but they still shine, calmly, quietly, for anyone who cares to look. And so he does. One last moment, one last breath. Then he turns, steps inside, and lets the night fully arrive. Night falls fully over Carthage, not with sudden darkness, but with a soft unfolding of shadow. The stars above now pulse steadily, their light traveling across centuries to bathe the sleeping city in quiet assurance. The breeze that moves through the upper levels of the homes carries the scent of salt and myrtle, brushing over rooftops and whispering through fig leaves. Within the walls of the citizen's home, all is still. The children are asleep, their soft breaths merging with the steady drip of the courtyard fountain. A clay lantern burns low, casting long, gentle lines across the stone floor. The citizen lies awake for a few moments longer, not from worry, but from thoughtfulness. He listens. To the house, to the night, to the subtle voice of time. In Carthage, the quiet is never empty. It is full of memory, of footsteps from the day, of laughter that has faded but still echoes faintly, of whispered promises between husband and wife, shared before the lamp is snuffed out. Sleep comes slowly, not forced. He does not chase it. He allows it. And when it arrives, it wraps around him like linen in the summer, cool, familiar, and light. Morning will come again, but for now, there is nothing to do but rest. Somewhere far off, the call of a sailor echoes faintly, lost in the distance. Perhaps someone late returning from the harbor, perhaps a dream, but the house remains undisturbed. The city, vast and layered, continues to breathe beneath the stars. At dawn, before the rooster crows, the first stirrings of life return. A woman in the neighboring house begins to prepare flatbread, the soft slap of dough against the wooden board almost rhythmic. A boy yawns beside the embers of a small fire, and in the citizen's home, he too begins to wake. Not all at once, but gradually, the ceiling beams look the same. The fountain sounds the same. But something has shifted. This is a new day. The same, but new. He rises, steps onto the cool floor, and stretches. His joints remind him of the years past, not painfully, but honestly. Every crack, every ache, is a record of days lived well. He washes, dresses, and steps out into the courtyard. The light is barely present, only a hint of silver along the edge of the roof. He pauses, not out of hesitation, but out of respect. The beginning of a day deserves reverence. At the altar beside the fig tree, he lights a small offering, incense made from crushed leaves and oil, a quiet gesture to the household gods. He says no words. The smoke rises without sound, curling into the air and disappearing as gently as it came. Across the city, Carthage begins again. Merchants pull back their shutters, fishermen unload their catch, street sweepers pass slowly with brooms made of bundled reeds. It is not dramatic, it is not ceremonial, it is real, and it is beautiful in its repetition. The citizen makes his way toward the harbor district today. He has a meeting with a ship captain, an old friend, who is due to return with goods from the southern coast. As he walks, he watches. A child carrying a jug of milk nearly trips over a stone. An older man with a curved back sits in a doorway, nodding to each passerby. Two dogs bark lazily at one another, then lie back down under a canopy of vines. It's all so familiar, and yet each morning holds a different note, a different rhythm. When he reaches the harbor, the sea is already alive. Boats bob gently in their moorings, the wooden planks of the docks creaking beneath careful feet. Crates are being lowered, nets sorted, loud voices compete with the cries of gulls overhead. But even here, in the city's most active zone, there is no chaos. There is order, born not from rules, but from habit, from shared understanding. His friend, the captain, greets him with a firm handshake and a grin. The ship brought back rare herbs, a few woven baskets, and clay jars of oil. They sit on a bench beside the dock, legs stretched out, talking of roots and weather, of old stories from the sea. Their conversation is slow, meandering. There is no urgency. The goods will wait. The world will not collapse if they linger a while longer. When they part, it is with no ceremony, just a nod and a smile. The citizen turns back toward the heart of the city, the sunlight growing stronger at his back. His steps are steady, his mind calm. It is only mid-morning, but already the day feels whole. In Carthage, that is enough. Life here is not measured in great moments. It is measured in presence. By midday, the sun hangs higher above Carthage, its warmth soaking into the stone of every building and brightening the narrow alleys that thread their way between courtyards and columns. The citizen returns from the harbor with a slower pace, his mind still carrying fragments of sea-salted air and the stories his old friend told. He passes familiar shops now open for trade, a copper seller arranging polished bowls into sunlight, a basket weaver displaying his newest pieces along the edge of his stall, and a vendor laying out figs that glisten with syrup under the sun's gaze. Carthage does not bustle in the frantic sense. Its rhythm is deliberate, like the ticking of a sundial. Every act, every exchange, is done with an unspoken agreement that time is valuable, not for how much can be crammed into it, but for how much care can be given to each thing it holds. He stops to purchase a few pieces of fruit, not out of necessity, but because the colors caught his eye, the kind of oranges that look like flames frozen in rind. The vendor recognizes him, offers a quiet greeting and a price fairer than expected. The citizen does not haggle. It is not a moment for bargaining. It is a moment for kindness. He continues on, passing under a trellis heavy with flowering vines. Somewhere nearby, a child sings. It is not a song he knows, perhaps something invented on the spot. It drifts into the air, wordless in parts, but full of joy. He smiles, though he does not stop walking. Carthage is built from such details. The scent of wet earth from a freshly scrubbed stoop, the hush of sandals on marble, the rustle of fabric as someone brushes past, the faded paint on an old door frame that has watched generations pass by. Arriving home, the courtyard is shaded now. The fountain's surface reflects the sky, a quiet mirror to the day unfolding above. His wife has begun preparing the afternoon meal, simple fare, lentils, herbs, a soft cheese wrapped in leaves. She hums while she works, not for anyone but herself. Their daughter helps without being asked, her hands already learning the movements that once belonged to her grandmother. They do not talk much. They do not need to. The citizen places the fruit gently into a bowl on the low table and washes his hands. The coolness of the water brings a kind of clarity. He notices the slight crack in the clay near the edge of the basin. He will mend it tomorrow, not now. There is no rush. They eat in the shade, each bite slow, the conversation meandering from the practical to the poetic. The son wonders how old the fig tree in the corner is. The father answers not with a number, but with a memory how he climbed it as a boy, and fell once, scraping his knee, then sat under it with his mother, who wiped away his tears and made him laugh again. The daughter asks about a shell she found, and whether it once came from the other side of the sea. The citizen tells her perhaps it did. That the sea is wide, yes, but it connects more than it separates. After the meal, the family lingers. They do not clear the table right away. They sit with the fullness of their bellies, their thoughts unfurling like sails in calm wind. The youngest doze for a while, curled in cushions near the steps. The citizen leans back, fingers laced behind his head, eyes half closed. He is not sleeping. He is listening to the stillness, to the creaking of the fig tree, to the quiet rhythm of breath that moves through the house like wind through reeds. When he stands again, it is to return briefly to his study. The scrolls he worked on yesterday now need review. He lays them out carefully on the wide table, his fingers smoothing the parchment, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the high window. He marks corrections with deliberate care, not because the stakes are high, but because the work deserves it. The scroll speaks of trade contracts and agreed routes, of who owes whom and when. But beyond the words is something else, a reflection of how Carthage works, not by force, but by trust, by writing things down, by remembering together. As the shadows begin to grow again, stretching long across the courtyard, he sets the scroll aside. A quiet satisfaction settles in his chest, not from what he has completed, but from how he has done it. He steps outside, where his wife is feeding birds. She scatters crumbs on the stone path, and they descend in a flurry of wings and gentle coos. The birds are not pets, they come and go, but they always return. Much like the rhythms of the day, much like the tides, much like everything in Carthage. He watches them, arms folded, content. He does not speak. He does not need to. Everything around him is already saying enough. As the final light of day begins to fade, Carthage softens once more into that gentle in-between, the space where time seems to hold its breath. The citizen stands in the upper gallery of his home, watching the sun slip behind the hills beyond the harbor. The sky, painted in deep gold and quiet pink, slowly deepens into a wash of blue-gray. Lanterns begin to glow across the city, little flickers of intention in the gathering dusk. The view from here stretches far, not just over rooftops, but across memory. He sees not only the streets of stone and clay, but the stories they've held, the parades of soldiers, the laughter of festivals, the silent return of fishermen at dawn. He's seen it all, and still, every sunset feels like a gift wrapped in silence. He takes a final breath of the salted breeze before turning inside. His steps are slow, not from weariness, but from reverence. He walks as one who knows the weight of a well-lived day. Downstairs, the home is quiet again. The children are washing up, giggling faintly behind the curtain near the fountain. His wife folds cloth in the corner, her motions smooth and practiced. A candle dances gently on the table. The room smells of crushed thyme and warm bread. Dinner has passed, but its memory lingers in the air. He sits for a moment, not to do anything in particular, but to arrive, fully, to this hour. The transition from day to night in Carthage is not marked by alarm or urgency. It is felt, understood, honored. He lights one final stick of incense and places it near the small household altar. The flame catches, glows, and sends up a ribbon of fragrant smoke, not as an offering of need, but as one of thanks. For breath, for warmth, for the chance to be present. Across the city, voices quiet. The markets close. Footsteps grow fewer. The sounds of animals being fed, of doors being drawn, of lullabies being hummed. They blend into the city's gentle surrender tonight. In this softness, time feels different. Less like something measured and more like something tasted. In his sleeping space, the bed has been arranged with fresh linen. A small cup of water waits nearby, along with a carved wooden comb, polished smooth by years of use. He moves slowly through his final tasks, washing his hands, combing his hair, adjusting the folds of his nightrobe. The fire in the brazier is nearly out now, casting only a low orange glow. He listens again, to everything, to nothing. His wife joins him. They do not speak. Their silence is not absence, but deep familiarity. She rests, and he settles beside her, hands folded across his chest, as if holding the quiet close. The children are now asleep in the other room. One of them turns over in their sleep, murmurs something unintelligible, then settles again. A night bird calls in the distance. The fig tree in the courtyard rustles faintly, moved by a breeze that barely touches anything else. The citizen's eyes grow heavy, but he resists sleep for one more moment, not out of anxiety, but to savor the final quiet of the day. He thinks of nothing grand, not war, not politics, not trade. He thinks only of the coolness of the sheets, the sound of water in the courtyard, the soft weight of being alive. His breathing slows, deeper, steadier. Leap when it comes does not crash over him. It slides in gently, like a tide at midnight, covering everything in soft stillness. Outside, Carthage sleeps, and within its walls, in a modest home lit by fading candlelight, a man who lived his day well now rests as deeply as the city itself. No dreams stir yet, only peace, only presence. And just beyond the courtyard wall, the stars begin their slow journey across the sky, watching silently over the city that knows how to end its days in calm. And so our quiet walk through the streets of ancient Carthage comes to an end. A day lived slowly, now folded gently into memory. Before we continue, if this peaceful journey brought you even a moment of rest, a like, and a soft little subscribe would mean more than you know. Now, without rushing, let your breath slow again, as we turn the page to another silent chapter of forgotten time. Next, in our series of boring history for sleep, we drift back even further, to the dustier edges of Mesopotamia, to witness not a fall with fire, but a fall with silence. This is the slow fall of the Akkadian Empire. The sun rose slowly over the Mesopotamian plain, spilling its light across dry riverbeds and stretches of cracked earth, where ancient canals once flowed with the careful precision of human hands. Long before the names Babylon or Assyria became known, there stood the Akkadian Empire, proud and broad, built not in haste, but in slow, deliberate expansion. Now, much later, in the quiet decline of its golden years, the land no longer hummed with the same urgency. The fields that once fed cities like Akkad and Sippar were beginning to tire. The irrigation channels, meticulously cut and once masterfully maintained, now carried only shallow streams of silted water. And though the temple still stood, weathered but firm, the prayers offered within them carried a different tone, less triumphant, more pleading. But decline was not sudden. It rarely ever is. Great empires, like great trees, do not fall in a single night. They fade, they lean, they begin to forget what they once were. And so it was with Akkad, Sargon the Great, whose name had once inspired awe and fear across the Fertile Crescent, had long since passed. His statues still stood in a few city squares, though their noses had crumbled and their stone robes were now soft-edged with erosion. People still spoke his name, but more as myth than memory. After him came his grandson, Naram-Sin, who had once dared to call himself a god, carved his victories into mountain stone, and built temples to himself. But even divine titles could not protect a man from the slow erosion of power. During his reign, the empire had stretched wide, too wide, from the Zagros Mountains in the east to the edges of the Levant in the west, from the green arc of the north to the parched southern marshes. But wide empires are thirsty ones, and the wells of control are not infinite. Resources needed to be pulled from farther and farther away. Armies needed to march longer. Messengers took more days to reach distant governors. And slowly, bit by bit, the tether between center and edge began to fray. Traders noticed it first. Roads once watched by guards grew quieter. Bandits emerged, not in hordes, but in twos and threes. Enough to make travelers nervous, enough to make goods more expensive. Farmers noticed it next. Rains grew irregular, the old flood patterns of the Tigris and Euphrates began to shift. Some years came with too much water, others with too little. The grain that once fed thousands now barely fed the village. And temples, those great centers of both faith and administration, began to speak more of angered gods than of proud kings. The priests no longer only blessed, they warned. Drought was no longer a rare visitor. It became a resident. The soil cracked deeper, the date palms bore less fruit, and behind closed doors, scribes recorded shortages and tallies that no longer matched the expectations carved into law. Yet daily life continued. That is the strange truth of decline. It can feel so normal, so slow, so woven into routine that no one notices the end until long after it has arrived. In the city of Akkad itself, the great walls still stood, markets still buzzed, potters shaped clay, bakers kneaded flour, children played with small carved animals. But among the elders, there was a quiet knowledge. The air was drier, the city a little quieter, the taxes a little heavier. One generation passed this sense to the next, not in scrolls, not in declarations, but in sighs, in smaller harvests, in stories that began with, "In the days when the rivers were fuller." Across the empire, small rebellions flickered, not loud, not large, but persistent. Governors in far cities stopped sending tributes on time. Some claimed they were simply delayed. Others, quietly, declared independence. Letters sent from the capital were answered more slowly, or not at all. The roads, once the pride of imperial logistics, began to fade into dusty paths, overgrown with stubborn weeds. Still, the people did not panic. They adjusted. That is what humans do. Merchants traded shorter distances. Farmers shifted to crops that needed less water. Priests adapted rituals to match the changing rhythms of sky and soil. Life continued. And in its continuation, the slow unraveling of Akkad moved forward, quiet as dawn. No thunder, no collapse. Only the faint hum of something once vast, becoming something slightly less. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the scribes began their work. In a quiet chamber within the administrative district of Akkad, the sharp ends of reed pens dipped into thick ink, and the soft scrape of stylus on clay was the only sound. Day after day, they copied lists, grain tallies, labor assignments, temple inventories, and shipments that had not arrived. What was once a form of mastery over distance and complexity had, over time, become a record of decline. A shipment that should have arrived from Marie 2 weeks ago was still absent. No word from the outpost in Dur. A scribe paused, finger pressed gently against a drawing cuneiform line, then added a small mark to indicate uncertainty. These marks had begun to appear more often. The empire had grown used to control. That was its foundation: order, bureaucracy, the quiet power of well-kept records. But as supplies delayed and outposts fell silent, doubt began to press its fingers into the clay. The scribes would never call it collapse. They would call it delay. They would call it adjustment. Still, the signs were clear. The once tightly coordinated provinces were drifting like barges loosed from their moorings. The king at the center of it all, Sharkali Shari, son of Naram Sin, felt the weight of a crown heavier than the one worn by his ancestors. His rule had begun in promise, but soon the names in his letters were unfamiliar. Allies were replaced by rivals. Cities once loyal whispered of independence. Even within Akkad, the palace grew quieter, not in silence, but in the absence of certainty. Fewer envoys arrived. Less tribute filled the storerooms. The royal court no longer held feasts with the frequency or grandeur it once did. It was not poverty, not yet, but it was a thinning, a gentle tapering of once abundant confidence. Outside the walls of the city, the earth bore its own signs of wear. The Euphrates still flowed, but its waters had turned sluggish and unreliable. Farmers found that old planting rhythms no longer worked. They would look to the sky with the same hope, but wait longer for rain. Crops grew smaller. Some farmers packed what little they had and moved north, where the water was said to be more generous. Villages that had once been dense with noise and livestock were left quieter. Empty homes gathered dust. Trade, too, grew hesitant. Caravans once laden with lapis lazuli, cedar, and tin now carried less. Some merchants spoke of strange raids on the road, of men who did not speak Akkadian, who moved quickly through the hills and disappeared just as fast. Some said they were Gutians, hill tribes from the Zagros, who did not bow to kings or gods, but to the cold logic of survival. Others said it was only rumor. But fear needs little truth to grow. Cities began to close their gates earlier in the day. Guards were doubled at night. Fires were watched more carefully. The priests, still robed in white, still standing in temples of mud, brick, and shadow, began to shift their tone. The old stories of the gods' favor were told more carefully now. Omens were read with more caution. A sudden eclipse, once a wonder, now became a warning. Birds flying west too early in the season were read as portents of betrayal. The divine order that had once underpinned the might of Akkad seemed unsettled. In private rituals, the priest would ask not just for victory, but for clarity, for reassurance, for signs that the gods had not turned away. In the markets of smaller towns, gossip replaced official word. Traders speculated on whether the king was still strong, whether Elam would move against the empire, whether the mountain tribes would descend, whether the rains would return. And though life went on, it went on with an air of waiting. Not dread exactly, but anticipation of something, change perhaps, or reckoning. Among the common people, the changes were felt most in silence, in bowls less full, in fathers gone longer from home seeking work, in the quiet resignation that tomorrow might not bring better, but they endured. That too was part of the empire's rhythm, not its glory, but its persistence. As the clay tablets dried under the hot Mesopotamian sun, one could almost imagine the empire still held fast, that it remained intact in the lines and numbers, the decrees and reports. But between those lines, between those well-drawn signs, something else had begun to right itself. Something slower, more honest. A long exhale. Beyond the structured walls of Akkad, far into the dusty periphery, where imperial authority once held firm, the edges of the empire began to dissolve in ways that were nearly imperceptible at first. Villages that once flew the king's banners simply stopped doing so. No rebellion, no dramatic declaration, only a quiet return to local rule. Small temple governors and hereditary chieftains, sensing the distant heartbeat of the capital slowing, no longer sent taxes or conscripts. It wasn't defiance, it was adjustment. Life adjusted, always, to the fading of great lights. In the highlands of the Zagros, where forests clung to rocky slopes and mist rolled across peaks at dawn, the Gutians began to move. They were not like the city dwellers. They kept no extensive records, carved no epics into stone, claimed no descent from gods, but they watched, and they waited. And when the caravans thinned and the border garrisons weakened, they tested the spaces in between. First with scouts, then with raids. They took livestock, tools, grain, never more than what could be carried quickly, never more than what would provoke a full military response. But such responses grew slower, less coordinated. There was no single moment when the empire decided it could no longer defend its borderlands. It simply didn't. The roads that once pulsed with traffic and dispatches became quieter. The great royal post system, a marvel of its time, where clay tablets stamped with official seals passed rapidly through stations, slowed, then faltered, then failed. And so knowledge itself dimmed. The king knew less, the governors guessed more, and into that guessing came uncertainty. Rumors replaced reports. Superstition replaced certainty. In the city of Nippur, a major religious center and once a proud link in the Akkadian chain of power, the high priests held their ceremonies with increasing solemnity. The gods of wind and water, once praised for their abundance, were now petitioned for forgiveness. Offerings were doubled. Processions grew longer, more elaborate, even as resources dwindled. The people gathered in the temple courtyards, watching the rituals with quiet faces, not sure if they believed, but sure that belief was better than despair. A traveler from the north might notice more abandoned fields along the road, less grain stacked in courtyards, fewer guards at the city gates, but it was in the people's faces, in their slower greetings and longer silences, where the change truly lived. A slow unwinding, a gentle resignation. In some places, foreign merchants stopped arriving altogether. In others, they arrived with bolder attitudes, no longer deferential to Akkadian officials. Trade continued, but without the same currency of awe. No longer was the Akkadian seal a guarantee of passage or protection. It was a relic, respected perhaps, but not feared. And so a subtle inversion occurred. What once radiated from the center now recoiled, and what had once been held at bay now advanced, not with conquest, but with quiet occupation. The Gutians moved deeper, not with armies, but with presence. Villages began to trade with them directly, not out of allegiance, but necessity. When grain could not be brought from Akkad, it was bartered from the hills. When tools broke and no blacksmith arrived from the capital, the hill tribes offered repairs, not out of kindness, out of opportunity. But in that exchange, loyalty shifted, not by proclamation, but by habit. Back in Akkad, the royal court still convened. There were still scrolls, still ministers, still proclamations etched in stone, but the stones were seen by fewer eyes, the words heard by fewer ears. The empire, still technically vast, now felt distant even within its own walls. A young scribe might study the maps and learn the names of far-off provinces, Subartu, Elam, Armanum, but he would know them only as shapes, as echoes. The reality beyond the walls no longer matched the images on the clay, and as time drifted forward, the empire, though still named, began to exist more as memory than as mechanism. The king still ruled, but with less reach. The people still lived, but with less certainty. The fall was not failure, it was fatigue. The long, slow fatigue of an empire stretched too far for too long, now exhaling into the dust. In the southern reaches of the empire, where the Euphrates coiled gently through old Sumerian lands, and the marshes whispered beneath the reeds, the ancient cities of Ur and Lagash stirred with a quiet independence. These cities had once bowed to Akkad out of necessity, out of admiration perhaps, or the simple logic of strength. But in time, as the empire's grip slackened and messengers arrived less frequently, local councils grew bolder. They began to appoint their own overseers, organize their own defenses, and levy their own taxes. No dramatic lines were drawn, no kings dethroned in ceremony. Rather, there was a drifting. The way a boat tied too loosely at its mooring begins to shift with the current. The people of these cities still remembered Sargon, of course. They remembered Naram-Sin too, but memory alone does not govern. And in the temples of these older cities, those with roots far deeper than the empire itself, the high priests began to speak once more in their own dialects, invoking gods with local names, gods who had watched over their people long before Akkadian banners ever flew. They lit fires and stone altars with cracked edges. They drew omens not from royal instruction, but from the old lunar charts passed from father to son, priest to priest. And the people followed, not out of rebellion, but out of familiarity. Meanwhile, in the north, the once bustling trading cities near the upper Tigris began to echo. The sounds of markets were quieter, the laughter in taverns thinner. Traders, who once arrived in long columns from Anatolia and beyond, now came in smaller numbers, often taking roundabout routes to avoid dangerous stretches of road. The great storehouses that held copper and timber, once counted and sealed by Akkadian scribes, stood half empty, not abandoned, but less attended, fewer guards, fewer scrolls. A sense that the flow of wealth had turned ever so slightly away from the imperial core. In the capital itself, the signs of wear deepened. The palace, built of sun-baked brick and lined with carved stone panels, remained impressive to any visitor. But within its halls, courtiers whispered more than they spoke. The royal guards, though still dressed in ceremonial attire, seemed less vigilant, their armor less polished. The royal gardens, once meticulously maintained, showed signs of neglect. Vines growing where they should not, pools collecting algae rather than lotus blossoms. And the king, Sharkali Shari, aged more by burden than by time, found himself staring longer at old maps than issuing new decrees. He had tried, there was no doubt of that. He had marched against rebellions. He had sent envoys to negotiate with distant governors. He had sacrificed to the gods, fasted on festival days, and upheld the rituals of kingship with quiet discipline. But the forces pulling his empire apart were not merely external. They were erosion, of trust, of communication, of the invisible lines that hold a kingdom together. And erosion cannot be defeated by decree. In the homes of the city's artisans and laborers, life moved forward, but always with a flicker of uncertainty. A potter might craft a bowl as he always had, but wonder whether anyone would buy it. A baker might knead his dough in silence, remembering a time when grain was cheaper and customers more abundant. Children still played in dusty courtyards, but their mothers watched them with a quieter concern, not for danger, but for direction, for what the future might hold when the center no longer held firm. On the outer walls of the city, guards rotated their posts with practiced boredom. The threat of invasion was still distant. No army marched openly, but there was talk, always talk, of tribes gathering, of roads no longer safe, of outposts gone dark. The Gutians, once spoken of in whispers, were now discussed openly in taverns and courtyards. Some feared them, others dismissed them, but all acknowledged their presence, like storm clouds on a far horizon. And so the empire stood, not in strength, but in memory, not in might, but in routine, like a grand clock whose gears still turned, even as its hands no longer kept perfect time. The people of Akkad did not mourn their empire's decline, for they did not yet see it as fallen. They saw only that things had changed, that the songs sung at night were older, that the markets closed a little earlier, that the stars were consulted more often than scrolls. In this way, the fall continued, not as a crash, but as a quiet forgetting. In the final years of the Akkadian Empire, what once had been bold declarations of sovereignty and grandeur softened into echoes that drifted across fading boundaries. The palace scribes, who had long chronicled victories and construction projects, began recording different things. Grain shortages in provinces that had once overflowed, missing messengers from regions that no longer answered, and broken treaties that had simply been forgotten rather than officially revoked. In older times, kings carved their triumphs into the cliffs and walls, shaping stone into permanence. But now, those walls remained blank, the stonemasons uncommissioned, the bronze chisels untouched. The bureaucratic machine, once the marvel of Mesopotamia, churned slower with each season. Clay tablets piled up with unanswered correspondence, and the royal archives, which had once been the nervous system of an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Levant, grew dusty and dim. Orders issued by the court took weeks, then months, to reach their destinations, if they arrived at all. Local governors began making decisions without waiting for the capital's blessing. Some of those decisions aligned with Akkadian law, others quietly did not. Still, the palace remained, its high walls, its throne rooms, its colonnades, and the people within its reach still called Sharkali Shari king. But further out, past the cities and canals, in the villages nestled near the mountain passes and the edges of the steppe, the name of Akkad no longer meant what it once had. The younger generations there had no memory of Sargon's conquests or Naram-Sin's glory. They knew only that the taxes collected by traveling officials had stopped, that soldiers no longer appeared in spring to recruit for distant campaigns, and that their marketplaces now filled with traders speaking new languages and carrying foreign wares. Some of these traders were Gutians, who had come not with banners or ultimatums, but with livestock, tools, and stories. They were neither welcomed nor resisted. They were simply absorbed, as the old network of control gave way to a new and less defined shape. In some ways, the collapse of the empire brought relief. In regions long burdened by tribute and quotas, there was a strange lightness in the air. Farmers kept more of their harvest. Artisans sold their goods without interference. Temples returned to older rites, invoking deities once demoted beneath Akkadian gods. In these corners of the world, history did not feel like loss. It felt like return, but in Akkad itself, the mood darkened. The river's flow grew less predictable. Floods came early or not at all. The irrigation systems, once maintained by labor corvée and state engineers, eroded in places, clogged in others. Fields that had yielded abundantly for generations began to sour. Bread grew more expensive, beer thinner. When people spoke of decline, they didn't use the word empire. They spoke of weather and roads and bad omens. They said things like, "The rains do not come as they used to," or "The grain from the north is never as fresh now." The decline in their eyes was not geopolitical. It was seasonal. It was spiritual. The priests, once insulated by ceremony, felt it too. Offerings dwindled. Processions shortened. Incantations to the gods of the wind, sun, and harvest began to include longer pleas, longer silences. Occasionally, a new star appeared in the sky, or a solar eclipse passed overhead. and people gathered to watch, not in wonder, but with unease. Such signs had always held meaning. Now they felt heavier. One night, in a corner shrine not far from the palace, an old priest whispered a line from a forgotten hymn. When kings fall silent, the gods do not shout. They whisper to the dust. And perhaps that was the sound now echoing through the empire. Not war drums or rebellion, but the soft rustling of things becoming undone. In the capital, some still hoped for revival, a new campaign, a new alliance, a new god perhaps. But outside the city gates, the world no longer waited. It moved on, as it always had, not with malice, but with indifference. For all its wonder, its innovation, its monuments and memory, the Akkadian Empire was still part of a larger rhythm, one that pulsed with rise and fall, with order and forgetting. And as the dust gathered on the statues and the moon rose over silent ziggurats, the great experiment that was Akkad receded quietly into the long and patient night of history. Among the final vestiges of Akkadian control were not armies or governors, but memories, the kind passed from elder to youth by firelight, retold in markets and beside irrigation ditches. They spoke of a time when the king's name echoed across all lands, when his likeness was carved into cliffs and sealed into every trade tablet, when the sun had not yet dimmed over Akkad. But in those final decades, the empire's reach was no longer measured in miles, but in recollections. The once centralized power now flickered like a fading lamp, still visible in the heart, but casting little warmth across its former expanse. One could walk for days through the rural stretches of the empire and never see a royal sigil, never pass a checkpoint, never meet a soldier. Instead, one met families who no longer remembered the last tax collector. One saw storehouses repurposed into stables. In the once meticulously arranged canal systems, water no longer flowed as it once did. Silt gathered in places long neglected. Crops failed more frequently. And when this happened, people did not send word to the capital. They sent prayers into the soil and looked to the hills. In the city of Sippar, a center once brimming with astronomical study and calendar keeping, observatories stood quiet. The scribes there had once tracked Venus and Mars, creating the rhythm for ritual and harvest. But without consistent support from the crown, many of them left. Some returned to their family lands, others simply faded from the records. The great libraries, which had once copied hymns and legal codes with care, slowed in their work. Tablets were left half-written. Shelves gathered dust. Even the language began to shift. The grand Akkadian inscriptions gave way in places to older Sumerian phrases, or newer dialects altogether. As the center weakened, the periphery revived its own tongue. No war announced this shift. It simply happened, day by day, as language always does. And with that slow linguistic drift came other quiet changes. Names given to children no longer honored imperial heroes, but local ancestors or mythic figures. Gods once elevated by royal decree fell out of favor in temples far from Akkad. In the city of Mari, which had once pledged fealty and sent tribute, the court there began addressing the king of Akkad with lesser titles, then eventually not at all. Local lords took on the trappings of sovereignty, building new temples, issuing decrees, reshaping local calendars. They did not secede. They simply stopped pretending. Back in Akkad, within the aging palace walls, time became more circular than linear. Rituals were performed as they always had been: sunrise offerings, festival chants, purification rites, but fewer people attended. The high officials who still counseled the king had grown old, and many had lost sons in distant conflicts. New advisors were harder to come by. The once vibrant court buzzed less with ambition and more with maintenance. Holding on became the goal. Holding on to tradition, to image, to the idea that Akkad still mattered beyond its crumbling avenues. The economy, once fueled by copper from the east and cedar from the west, slowed to a trickle. Without imperial oversight, long-distance trade became risky. Merchants turned inward, relying on local partners rather than cross-regional networks. Markets grew more modest. The grand bazaars of the capital, once roaring with foreign voices and colorful wares, became quiet places where familiar faces traded familiar things. Coins and seals still bore the king's insignia, but their value lay more in habit than enforcement. People accepted them out of routine, not reverence. Even the temple economy, once robust and central to Akkadian administration, thinned. Priests began leasing temple lands not to serve empire, but to survive. And as the treasury dried, so too did state generosity. Public granaries stood increasingly empty. In times of drought, no imperial aid came. Communities turned inward. Neighbors supported one another, not the throne. A great shrinking had taken place, not visible from the ziggurats, but palpable in the alleys and farmlands. The empire had not collapsed, it had simply receded, and what remained was not ruin, but residue. A culture worn thin, like an old garment still worn for comfort, long after it ceased to fit. The people of Akkad did not lament with grand speeches or violent revolt. They endured. They adapted. They turned their gaze inward and downward, to the earth, to the cycles of sun and flood, to the rhythms older than kings. The empire's fall was not a flame extinguished. It was a fire allowed to burn itself out, leaving behind ash that would someday nourish the roots of something new. Far to the east of Akkad's fading heart, the sun rose over dry hills and silent watchtowers, casting long shadows across the forgotten edges of an empire that had once dared to believe it would last forever. There, where dust clung to abandoned roads and the wind whispered through cracked stone, the memory of rule lingered, not in banners or troops, but in the shape of things. Walls built at angles only Akkadian architects favored, wells aligned to ancient surveyors' stars, the faint echo of hymns once recited before dawn by priests who now slept beneath those same stones. In these outer regions, the idea of empire had long since drifted into abstraction. The names of kings were no longer relevant. What mattered now were the seasons, the rainfall, the sturdiness of the barley, the patience of oxen. Yet even here, traces of the old order remained. Some elders still told stories of Sargon, of the time when emissaries from lands no one had seen would bow before the Akkadian seal. Children listened, not because they understood, but because the voice telling it trembled with something sacred. In the village shrines and quiet temples, the gods had changed, not vanished, but reshuffled. Local deities once overshadowed by imperial cults now re-emerged, not in rebellion, but in quiet continuity. Statues worn down by time were not replaced with fresher images of distant gods. Instead, they were gently mended, garlanded, and placed once more at the center of seasonal rites. When the rains came, they were thanked. When they failed, they were pleaded with. The rhythms were older than Akkad, and so they remained. Meanwhile, the core of the empire, what was once the shining city of Akkad itself, shifted slowly into something less definable. Not a ruin, not yet, but no longer a beacon either. The great temples were still there, their walls still standing, their stairways still leading upward. But fewer feet climbed them now. The chants from within echoed more than they once did. Less crowded, less certain. The treasury halls echoed too, not with coin or command, but with absence. The chests once filled with tribute from across the land and now stood partly open and partly forgotten. What wealth remained was invested not in expansion, but in preservation, patching the roads, feeding the scribes, paying the guards who still stood at the gates out of loyalty, habit, or the absence of anywhere else to go. The merchants who remained no longer carried dreams of empire. Their ledgers recorded more modest ambitions, enough copper to forge tools, enough wool to trade for grain, enough salt to make it through the dry months. The grand exports of cedar and lapis had become stories, not goods. In the silence that follows grandeur, even the air seems to listen differently. Travelers still pass through, from the Zagros to the west, or down the rivers that once carried the ambitions of kings. But they no longer came to kneel or pledge loyalty. They came to trade, to rest, to move on. And the people of Akkad, those who remembered the empire and those who only knew its fading, welcomed them not as subjects, but as neighbors, for the identity of the empire had begun to soften, to blend with the very cultures it once sought to dominate. The Akkadian tongue remained, but with borrowed words and strange accents. The laws persisted, but altered by the practicalities of local life. Even the architecture, once rigid and imposing, had become more relaxed, more responsive to the land. As the empire dissolved, it did not disappear. It diffused. And in that diffusion, it seeded something else, something quieter, perhaps, but more enduring. Among the scribes who still copied texts onto clay tablets, there were those who began to blend styles, Akkadian with Sumerian, with Elamite, even with the languages of the traders, not to rebel against empire, but to reflect the world as it now was, layered, complex, unresolved. The story of Akkad was no longer one of conquest. It was one of change. It moved now like the river in drought, slower, more uncertain, but still moving. And as twilight settled once more across the land, painting the ziggurats with gold and then shadow, those who looked up did not wonder when glory would return. They wondered instead what would come next, and whether it too would pass as gently as this. Because in the end, it was not collapse that defined Akkad, but quiet persistence, the way even in its last breath, the empire gave space for what followed and did so without storm or scream, but with the patience of stone. As the years stretched on, the name Akkad became less a title of dominion and more a distant echo, a word spoken with a kind of reverence that bordered on myth. No decrees were sent from the throne anymore, no great statues raised in honor of new victories. The empire, once a tightly woven tapestry of laws, cities, and vassals, had become something looser, more frayed, yet oddly enduring. Local leaders, some descended from governors appointed long ago by Akkadian kings, now ruled in practice, if not in name. They administered justice, collected grain, and prayed to gods that felt closer than the distant, aging sovereign still said to rule from the west. Even in the capital, which once pulsed with the blood of empire, the rhythm had changed. The great avenues, once filled with parades and foreign emissaries, were now walked by weavers, bakers, and the occasional merchant, kunkal, whose goods came not from the far reaches of a vast realm, but from the surrounding countryside. People still looked up at the towering ziggurat, but now as something ancient, not central, like a mountain that had once erupted but now merely loomed, quiet and still. Time moved differently in these final chapters. There were no grand battles marking the end. No date historians could circle in clay. What happened instead was weather and waiting. The skies grew hotter, rains came less often. Entire regions faced harvest after harvest of disappointment. Wells dug deeper yielded little, and so people moved. Not all at once, not in panic, but in slow, measured steps. Entire families leaving ancestral homes for greener valleys, for cities with stronger walls, or for whatever promise the horizon could offer. This migration did more to dissolve the empire than any enemy ever had. As the people spread out, so too did their customs, their dialects, their stories. Akkadian culture did not vanish, it scattered, like seeds on dry wind. And in that scattering, it mingled with others, adapting, softening, becoming something new. The scribes who once chronicled royal triumphs now wrote poems of longing, wisdom texts about surviving hardship, and quiet prayers etched into clay with slow, careful hands. In one such fragment, found centuries later, a scribe had written not of kings, but of stillness. When the river forgets its name, the fish do not mourn, they swim. Perhaps that line best captures what remained of Akkad in its twilight. There was no mourning in the fields, only adjustment. Temples continued their rituals, even if the offerings were smaller. Families gathered at dusk to retell the stories of how things once were, not to reclaim the past, but to carry its warmth. Children still learned to read and write, though more often in hybrid tongues that mixed Akkadian with the rhythms of whatever village raised them. And though fewer people called themselves by the empire's name, they still built with the techniques its engineers had mastered. They still shaped clay the way Akkadian potters had taught. They still looked to the stars for omens, even if they no longer followed the old calendar. Empire became legacy, and legacy became habit, quiet and unseen, but never truly lost. Meanwhile, in regions far to the north and east, new powers began to stir. City-states once subdued under Akkadian rule began crafting their own identities. They borrowed what they needed: administrative systems, religious forms, agricultural methods, but did not pledge allegiance. In many ways, this was Akkad's final gift, a foundation broad and steady upon which others could build. And though no armies rode out from Akkad anymore, its presence could still be felt in the way walls were shaped, in the structure of law codes, in the tone of a hymn rising from a temple courtyard. It was no longer a matter of authority. It was one of influence, of roots sunk so deep that even as the tree withered, shoots emerged nearby, bearing familiar leaves. The empire had passed from memory into pattern, into the quiet mechanics of daily life. And so, as the sun set over the long-faded capital, no trumpet sounded, no bell tolled, only the hush of wind through date palms, the low murmur of a family finishing supper, the distant clink of clay cups. In that hush, the legacy of Akkad lived on, not as empire, not as power, but as presence, gentle, persistent, and utterly at peace with being forgotten by history, as long as it was remembered by the heart. In the years that followed the silent unraveling of Akkad's core, the land entered a strange in-between, a time neither fully belonging to the empire nor to whatever would come after. Scholars writing centuries later would call this an interlude or a dark age, but for the people who lived through it, it was simply life, with its familiar mix of routines and uncertainty. Farmers still woke before the sun, their hands coarse from years of coaxing grain from reluctant soil. They still whispered old blessings as they planted, some in the language of Akkad, others in tongues once pushed to the margins, but now returning like old roots beneath dry earth. Traders still bartered under the shade of weather-worn stalls, their goods simpler than before, more local, more essential. Bronze tools, clay vessels, sacks of dried lentils, perhaps a faded relic from an earlier time traded more for sentiment than value. In these markets, the names of old kings were sometimes spoken, but not as rulers, more like myths, folded into stories told to curious children. There was once a man named Sargon, an elder might begin. Brushing dust from a carved seal, he commanded rivers and cities and gods alike. The child would blink, wide-eyed, unaware that the street they stood on was once swept for that very king's arrival. It was in this slow fading that the true legacy of Akkad embedded itself, not in grandeur, but in the ordinary. The empire had left behind no final war, no decisive end. Instead, it had melted, almost kindly, into the soil, the stone, and the speech of everyday life. A potter shaping clay might still hum a tune, passed down through generations, unaware it had once been sung in the royal courts. A priest reciting morning prayers might wear robes cut in patterns first designed by Akkadian scribes, the meanings of the folds now forgotten. But the rhythm of devotion unchanged. Even the way settlements align their streets, parallel to rising stars, in grids thought to please the gods, echoed lessons once enforced by imperial surveyors. And so, without proclamation, the empire endured, not as ruler, but as memory. Further north, strange weather patterns began to shape new realities. The rains became erratic. Some years, the rivers would flood and bless the fields with silt. Others, they would shrink to trickles, leaving cracked earth and thin harvests. Communities that had once relied on a broader imperial system now relied on each other. Alliances formed, not under banners, but around wells and granaries. Leadership was no longer appointed from a distant court, but chosen from those who remembered when the storage jars were last full. Wisdom became more valuable than title, experience more trusted than bloodline. In this new order, the old systems did not disappear, they adapted. The tablets once used to record taxes were now used to mark seed counts and store ancestral recipes. The temples remained, though their gods sometimes shifted names or merged with local spirits. The walls were repaired with whatever stone was available, whether from new quarries or repurposed ruins. No one mourned the change aloud, but in their quiet adjustments, they honored the past. Travelers who passed through these lands carried strange stories. Some claimed the empire had never truly existed, that it was a tale told by merchants to make their wares seem exotic. Others insisted Akkad still lived, somewhere in the west, hidden, watching. And though most knew these were fantasies, no one corrected them. Because in a way, both were true. The empire no longer ruled, but it had not died. It had settled into something older than kings, something closer to breath. And in the quiet moments between tasks, in the press of a seal, the flicker of a lamp, the wind through barley stalks, you could still feel it. Not as a force of power, but as a hush, a presence, a pause in the noise of history. And that pause, like a held breath before sleep, was where Akkad now lived. And so, in the final stretches of the Akkadian story, the empire became not an ending, but a whisper stretched across centuries. The slow fall had no final battle, no roaring collapse, no flames to light the night. Instead, it drifted downward like autumn leaves settling into soil, unnoticed by the sky. The last generations who called themselves Akkadians did not know they were the last. They planted fields, carved tablets, murmured lullabies in half-remembered tongues. In distant corners of the once unified land, children learned names of rivers and gods their ancestors had spoken with certainty, though now these names arrived softened, changed, passed through the sieve of time. When temples closed, it was not with ceremony, but with silence. One day the priest simply did not return. One evening, the oil in the lamp ran out, and no one refilled it. The ziggurats weathered into pyramids of moss and sand. The great roads cracked under the weight of disuse. And yet, people remained. They gathered beneath trees that once lined courtyards. They used bricks from palaces to build kitchens and barns. They sang songs that were not quite ancient, not quite new. In these quiet acts, a different kind of history was written, not by kings or scribes, but by those who endured. And if you had walked among them, if you had wandered through a village where clay pots were shaped just as they had been for 1,000 years, you might not have realized an empire had fallen at all. You might have thought nothing changed. And in a way, you would have been right, for the essence of Akkad had shifted from buildings to behaviors, from monuments to memory. It became a part of the rhythm of life itself. In the far west, where Sargon's name had once carried thunder, his legacy now echoed in irrigation ditches and in stories told to soothe anxious children at dusk. Long ago, they would say, there was a city of red stone where the stars knew your name. No one asked where it was. No one needed proof. It lived in the telling, and the telling was enough. Over time, new powers rose, carrying banners etched in unfamiliar scripts, led by rulers whose bloodlines traced not to Akkad, but to ambition. They built cities where others had crumbled. They raised new laws, some fresh, some borrowed from forgotten codes buried beneath the dust. These new empires did not always know they were walking paths first paved by Akkad. But the traces were there, in the angles of their courtyards, in the cadence of their diplomacy, in the way they recorded grain and rainfall, drought and marriage, trade and death. Akkad was no longer a place, it was a pattern. And patterns, unlike cities, do not crumble. They shift, they persist. They fold into what comes next. Centuries later, archaeologists would stumble upon clay tablets in foreign soil, tablets inscribed with signs long thought extinct. And in those signs, they'd hear faint voices, voices of merchants tallying goods, of daughters writing to distant fathers, of a scribe drafting a hymn to a god whose name had long since vanished. These were not grand declarations of conquest or glory. They were fragments of the everyday, and in their smallness, they spoke louder than any monument. For empires often believe they will last forever. But it is the quiet acts, the shaping of a jar, the telling of a tale, the planting of a seed that truly endure. In the end, the Akkadian Empire did not vanish. It settled, it softened. It became the soil from which countless others would grow. And though no trumpet sounded for its passing, though no date marked its fall, it left behind something more profound than rule. It left behind a way of being, a rhythm, a hum, beneath the surface of all that came after. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all, not to be remembered for power, but to become a part of the silence that shapes the world. A silence that still echoes, even now, as you rest. And the past folds itself gently around your sleep. Thank you for staying with me through the quiet journey tonight. I'll see you again tomorrow evening with another soft story to help you rest. And when morning comes, may your day be filled with calm moments, gentle luck, and the quiet strength to carry you through. Good night and goodbye for now, until we meet again.